Can I join you here, Sopatis? Hello. Socrates was entertaining you. What's going on, buddy? Let's see. You are in a bookstore or are you at home? I am at home. This is my office / library. Stuff spreads all through the house, but this is where much of it is. I don't know what that means. Go live together. There's, huh. Let's see. Hey. Oh, did you chase Socrates away? You booger. Hey, it's mine. Yeah. Yeah, so this one is Minerva. Socrates was here a moment ago, but she's top cat right now, so if she wants the spot, she's going to get it. That's just how that goes. How was my drive? Oh, that was horrible. Turns out it was a bunch of rubberneckers, probably thousands of them. There's a bit of a bottleneck for me to get to where I live, and just one little freeway crossing the mountain. And I saw a whole bunch of floodlights along one side. Didn't seem like lanes were blocked. I don't know what was going on, but I didn't look because that's what slows traffic down. But as soon as we were past the lights, we're zipping along. But that's close to my ramp, so oh well. Let's see. Yeah, that was 5.5 hours. So that was brutal. Usually closer to 3. Sometimes a little longer. Hello. Let's see. Oh, interesting question about Gramsci. I actually put up a short meditation about Gramsci a while back on my YouTube because somebody else had asked about that. Occurs to me every now and then. Let's see. What do I think of Gramsci? My Frankfurt School stuff is down here. That's all of Gramsci's stuff, and then the very common essential one is here, but it's the sun bleached it out. But that's the complete prison notebooks. Definitely underrated in some ways, but probably overused in others by this point. Got to be really influential in a lot of modern social analysis. Let's see. Kite's journal stuff on reevaluating. Nope, I have not. So nope, don't know what that is. Let's see. Scrolling on back. Oh, look, there's one of those little request things. Let's hit. Where am I from? I'm in Southern California, which I suppose is also where I'm from. I bopped around a lot traveling, but I'm a Californian. I drive the route every day. Someone's asking, but the amount of traffic varies a lot because of the times. from semester to semester. It depends on what time my classes finish and whether I can kill time in the areas to avoid rush hour. This term, it happens 3 days coincide with rush hour for the drive back up, which would be horrifying. Normally, I would kill a whole lot of time down the hill, so the drive up is better. But I really can't because I have a dog problem lately. Um, my my elderly doggy Amira had been going to classes with me for got to be over a decade, but she's too old to hold it effectively. She doesn't even notice it. She's just standing there and shit drops out. So you can't really have that happening in classes. She still has a wonderful attitude. She's still a great kid, but she just can't hold it anymore. So she's going to stay here. I was planning on finishing the work, building a fence in the spring when it's warmer and I have more time. But I'm trying to finish it now, just largely because of her, so that she's not stuck in the house all day. She's now stuck in the house for 13, 14-hour stretches on 3 days a week. So I got to rush back up and sit through all that traffic in order to get back up here for her. Let's see. Someone asked who is Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci was an Italian Marxist philosopher from the beginning of the 20th century. He died in one of Mussolini's prisons. I'm new. Is this your library? This is my office. I'm restoring my grandfather's old cabin as a house. I've been doing a project a little bit at a time for a while. This should be a master bedroom out of the 2 bedrooms here. I sleep in the small one, and even there are 6 bookcases in the small bedroom, and it's a tiny bedroom. But I basically subdivided this room with a back-to-back set of bookcases to create an alcove and filled every possible space in this room up with them. House is only so big, and I squeezed like 52 bookcases into here. Let's see. That's a good question. Why is the U.S. government not listening to the Why is the U.S. government not listening to the American public about a ceasefire? Well, isn't that the $10,000 question of the day? Since we just vetoed that very, very predictably. Okay, so here's a fun point I want to make, because I occasionally get comments on posts about this that tend to lean into dangerous old conspiracy theories about Jews controlling the media and politics in the world. That's never been true, and now people just frequently say Zionist instead of Jew, but that doesn't make it any less an anti-Semitic conspiracy. There are a lot of reasons that the American political system and its allies in the media will not favor a ceasefire, and it has a lot more to do with, in the specific case of Israel, the deep issues of Christian Zionism in this country, and Christian Zionism actually predates Jewish Zionism as an ideal. And there's a lot of it here. The United States was kind of like a breeding ground for it in the 19th century. And on top of that, we have that whole solidarity as settler colonies. Yay, genocidal settler colonies. Ooh, yeah. So kind of like get along on issues like that. The U.S. has generally been on the wrong side of a lot of issues. If anybody's laboring under the illusion that the U.S. is a bastion of freedom in the world, boy, do I have 250 years of U.S. foreign policy to sell you. Guess, it's a load of shit. The As European empires were coming apart, we backed the imperialists every single time. So, this is just more of the same. Israel is a nice, wealthy country that we're allied to politically. Hi, that's my snack. You can't just stick your paw in there. You don't even like this stuff. Moshe loved it. You don't. See, if I give some to you, you're not going to eat it. You just want to get in there and poke at it. Oh, actually, you will try it. Oh, look at that. Cat's going to steal some of my cheese. generally doesn't care much for this stuff. The cat of mine that died about a month ago was a major cheese hound. He loved this stuff. Normally, this isn't her thing, but you're also attention starved, so I'm going to be stealing some of my cheeses to work for you. Here, let me give you some here. Mira, va. Buena, buena. Buena, buena. Mira. Okay. Sharing cheese with a cat. All right, let's see. Scroll on down here, see if there's anybody else asking to pop up. Nope, nothing out there yet. I'm new to your channel. No, I already saw that one. Is there an academic syllabus on Judaic studying? Um, hmm. I'm not sure I have a syllabi that specifically deal with. I mean, I deal with anti-colonialism and decolonization in several classes, but I don't really have a class on it per se. I guess the closest we'd come to that is I did write a class one year for a European program on the French Empire specifically. But no, I deal with like decolonization in my Arab world class. I deal with decolonization in modern world histories, things like that. But I don't really have a syllabus specifically on it. I could possibly post some readings that I assign if somebody's interested. You know, I in my classes I assign a lot of primary documents that I scanned in from different places or translated myself and put up in little PDFs. But I also steal chapters from books all the time, so they don't have to buy the whole books. Like here's a chapter from this book, whatever, and put up things. So there's a whole bunch of that kind of stuff I could share somewhere if somebody's interested in something. As far as Judaic studies, I deal with Jewish history in the context of other classes. Same thing. The closest to Judaic studies would be the Israel-Palestine class that I wrote that goes back across 4,000 years. But it's specific to the region, not to like world Jewry. I deal with Jews in different places in a number of different classes. So French and German Jewry and some European history classes, the Jews of the Arab world in my Middle East courses, things like that. But I don't technically teach Judaic studies or like a whole class on like global Jewish history per se. What kind of music do I enjoy listening to? Now, that's an interesting question. I have very broad tastes in music. I used to say I have very Catholic tastes in music, but that confused people. Catholic meaning universal, small c, Catholic. I listen to any kind of music. It depends largely on my mood. So I'll do everything from vocal jazz to classical to death metal to psychedelic trance. It really depends upon where I am, what I'm doing. Certain things work better for my working, like if I'm writing. Is there certain types of music to work well? Ambient is really good for that. Grading, I like something with a little bit of a beat, but not a lot of lyrics. If I'm working out in my backyard, I tend to put on things like classic rock. So I'll sing along with, Crosby, Stills and Nash and America and Beatles and things like that while I'm doing that, because that'll keep me entertained. Or I don't know if I'm in the right kind of mood, I'll put some vocal jazz on for that too. But I listen to a lot of metal. I'm definitely a bit of a metalhead. Do a lot of metal shows. I like a lot of folk metal. I tend to like a lot of bands from around the world. So I listen to a lot more. I listen to a lot more metal bands from Europe, Africa, and Asia than I do from the U.S. Would sleep on the couch so I can. Yeah, I would sleep on the couch so I can have a library. Someone says, "Yeah, I have often felt the same way." Until I started inheriting antiques from dying relatives, I didn't have much other than my books. I had like a little tiny IKEA love seat, and at one point I slept on a futon. I didn't bother with a whole lot of furniture. I cared a lot more about keeping the books. How do you feel about Noam Chomsky? I was always a bit of a fan. Chomsky's an interesting fellow. There are problems with him, like with anything, but I do have a lot of respect for him. Certainly as a media analyst and an analyst of U.S. foreign policy, and I kind of relate to him in the sense that he's a pragmatic anarchist, and so am I. Like I vote in every election, but I'm also an anarchist. But the harm reduction, strategic harm reduction, it's always helpful. Um, Granted, in big national elections, like no one I've ever supported for president has ever won, and they're never going to. But I live in California, so my vote for president doesn't really matter. My votes on local levels, they really do matter. So I care a lot about those kind of things and ballot initiatives and everything else. But yeah, Chomsky's an interesting fella. I've always had a lot of respect for him. I want Muslims to be. Oh, that's a note here. Hello, cat. Usually there's a bunch of people asking to pop up here, but let's see. Most of this cheese over here. Let's put that over here. Hey, dog. You want her little leftovers? You want some crumbs? Here you go. You can have that. Oh yeah, happy dog. Let's see. Byzantium. Let's see. Let's see if there's a. Do you know who the Sea People were? Now that's an interesting. Put that down. That'll be kind of obscure for some people. All right. Hello, Minerva. Yes, I see you in the way. I was curious about if Dome of the Rock was built on the temple. Oh, now that is an interesting one. I was actually just thinking about the Dome of the Rock earlier today, so that's a fascinating question to come up here. So, let's see. Oh, look, there's little pop-up requests. Let me hit those here. A little harder to watch everything in the chat. Okay, let's see. So I've got someone asking about Muslims defeating Byzantium, somebody asking about the Sea Peoples, and then someone asking about the Dome of the Rock. Let's go in reverse chronology, kind of. The defeat of Byzantium is a long, long story because they actually stayed very strong all through the Middle Ages. We're into the High Middle Ages anyway. And generally repelled all of the early Arab attacks at them. They lost some territory initially. They lost Egypt and Syria, two very wealthy provinces for the East Roman Empire. But that's largely because they had spent 25 years fighting the Persians, the Sassanid Persian Empire, and had exhausted themselves. And then these dudes just charge up out of Arabia out of nowhere. I'm like, what the hell's going on? Like, they weren't ready for it at all. So they failed there, but they held their own from that point on for a long time. The main reason that they eventually started coming apart, there's a few factors. There was a significant uptick in their fortunes for a while. They were actually reconquering territory and gaining in strength. But then a particularly effective dynasty ended, and they got a few people in that were completely fucking incompetent. And that happened right as the time that Turks were really starting to settle in the areas in large numbers. Instead of just migrating in a little bit at a time and settling in the central part of Anatolia, they started pouring in, and you end up with the Great Seljuk state. And the Seljuks kicked their asses a bit. And then as they mistakenly, I think, cried to Western Europe for help, and a bunch of crusaders came in. The crusaders made things much, much worse. In the First Crusade, they caused a tremendous amount of damage inside the Roman Empire, ultimately severely weakening it. And this created a great deal of resentment. They then, kept, being antagonistic towards the Crusaders for a while. And that eventually got so bad that in the Fourth Crusade, they decided, screw going to the Holy Land and fighting Muslims. Let's just attack the Roman Empire, and they did. So in 1204, the Crusaders sacked Constantinople. So ultimately, the way is cleared for Muslims to conquer the rest of it because the Crusaders fucked it up. The damage caused by that is what advantaged the Ottoman state, and the Ottomans grew rapidly from that point on, gained more and more strength, and then
by 1453 finally took the city itself. But by that point, the Roman Empire controlled the Golden Horn, where Constantinople is, and most of the Peloponnesian Peninsula, the very bottom of Greece. That was it. That was the whole empire. So they lost the empire largely because of the Crusades and one incompetent administration just before the Crusades. So it's a lot of factors. It's not necessarily just Muslim power growing, although Muslims did whittle away at it for quite some time. What's this? Somebody sent cat. I don't know what that means, but how cute is that? But you can't have my cat. No, not this one. Let's see. I wonder if there's anything else I missed here. It's okay. So chronology wise, oh yeah, the Dome of the Rock. I was actually just thinking about that because someone was. I noticed there was somebody talking on one of the posts there about. A lot of people want to think that scriptural traditions are all perfect and revealed exactly the way they are from God at that moment, in the same way that so uh, many Orthodox Jews believe that Moses wrote the whole Torah, including the part where he dies. There are a lot of Christians who believe that every word of their Bible is the word of God and infallible. There are plenty of Muslims who feel the same way about Quran, but the fact is, scriptures all around the world, they build up over time. Over time, they kind of they build on a lot of previous stories. They all kind of assemble on top of previous layers. And there's a one interesting piece of evidence around the fact that some elements of Quran were still kind of in flux is that there are inscriptions inside the Dome of the Rock, quotations from Quran that actually differ a little bit from the actual text as it comes down to us. It has kind of suggesting that they hadn't fully locked it in yet. But it's close. The interesting thing, I bring this up in a lot of classes. One of the things that's fascinating about Islam is that the process of assembling the scriptures happens much faster for Muslims. But if you're going to include Quran and the major collections of Hadith and the biographies of the Prophet, you're looking maybe 300 years total for all of it to kind of be locked in a stable way, where that process took, gosh, almost 6 centuries for Christians, eight centuries for Jews. It took a lot longer to lock in the text and stop them from shifting, because changes in the way that these ideas are held, the way the different religious ideas were held, that was sort of normal in the world. In the ancient world, religions didn't work the way a lot of people expect, and they were mostly functioned on, hey, that's mine. Hey, me. Um, they were mostly held in ritual senses, certain things that you would do. There's a transactional relationship with the gods, and then the stories themselves could shift and change over time. What was most important was the ritual relationship with the gods. But developing complex theologies and stories that aren't supposed to change and they're supposed to be this is supposed to have really happened kind of thing, that as an idea really only gets going in the late classical period, and actually Islam is part of that transition. So there's some fascinating innovations in early Islam that helped us see that transition from the late classical into a more medieval mentality, where you cared a lot more about accuracy and getting things quite right. So I think the whole process is fascinating. But as far as the dome itself, one of the reasons it's important is that it's very, very old. It's the finest surviving example of Umayyad era architecture, and the Umayyads are the first great Arab empire after the Rashidun Caliphate. And the so it's been there for quite some time. As to whether it's on the exact side of the temple, that gets tricky. Very likely, yes, because no one can really tear the whole haram apart in order to find out. Dig below the levels of the stones there and see how that works. It's hard to say exactly where the lines were. The outlines of the different temples that were there, but the Inside the dome is an exposed piece of bedrock at the top of that hill, and the hill itself is the sacred part. That's why the temple was built on it. And later they built walls around it, filled it in to create a giant raised platform. But originally it's just a hill, and the hill has a small temple on top of it. So the original, like a first temple, the one destroyed much earlier by Babylonians, that would have been a pretty small affair, not a very big elaborate thing. Even the second temple that was paid for by the Persians would not have been all that elaborate. The really significant construction only really happens around the time of Herod, and it kind of like takes on a kind of like Romanesque, like much more grandiose thing, and then gets destroyed, less than a century later. But the earlier temples would have been relatively small, and because of that, it's very likely that they would have been right on top of that hill, right where that outcropping of rock is. That location where the piece of rock, exposed rock is, it's inside the dome, is probably where the Holy of Holies was inside the original temple, the place where only the high priest could go. Again, it's hard to know for sure, but that's the best guess, kind of like archaeologically, and thinking in terms of like the religious texts, how they describe everything around that. So very likely, yeah, the dome is right where the temple used to be. This is one of the reasons that the Israeli government has actually foiled several attempts to destroy the dome by religious Zionists, because they need it to go away if there's going to be a new temple. So yeah, that's kind of goofy. Um, the last one I saw in the chat that I marked down is probably a simpler one. Who the sea peoples are, it's probably an amalgamation of several populations, but very likely the Peliset is one of them, or a main one. So that would be um, ancestors of the Philistines. Um, but they wouldn't have been the only one, because there were a lot of people on the move. This is during the Bronze Age collapse, so there's a lot of political and economic and environmental catastrophes all happening at once in the late Bronze Age, kind of getting really, really messed up. I mean, the Hittite Empire completely collapses. The Mycenaean state completely collapses. Egypt gets severely weakened. There's a whole lot of catastrophes here, and because of that, there's a lot of peoples moving around and settling in different areas. So there's a population that does settle along the southern coast of the Levant. And we think they may be one of the sea peoples, but it's hard to say that they are the sea peoples per se. The problem is the records are extremely fragmentary, but enough to tell us that there were a lot of people on the move. So it's kind of a giant mess. You couldn't just say Philistines are the sea peoples. That wouldn't be sufficient. But they're one of the ones that we do know of by name. There are a handful of others actually mentioned in Egyptian records, but it's difficult to trace what happened to them afterwards. So they're not as interesting, I guess, frequently to people. We know a lot of what happens afterwards with the Philistines because of their interaction with the Canaanite peoples afterwards, so they exist in other records. Many of the other populations that show up for a while, they don't stick around. They basically assimilate, well, which ultimately happens to the Philistines too. They blend into Canaanite culture. They lose their own distinctiveness and language, but the others essentially disappear without a trace for the most part. Oh yeah, let's see. Hey, there's three people now hanging out here in the little thing along the side. Does anyone want to say hello here, so I don't have to keep scrolling through the chat for things? Or should I keep looking back for more things down here?
Oh, good evening, Doc.
Good
See you again. Hey, we've got to a point, and I do watch probably more lives than I should during the week. But I have a it's not going to be a quick question, but I think we left off last week at when running short of time. One biggest conflict that I see here, and I know you've addressed it as well in your posts. Um, People are intimidated by this and sometimes overwhelmed by the whole conflict. But at the end of the day, you did say that historically there were lots of examples of opportunities where, these conflicts were able to be solved into, building a sustainable solution society, whatever it be called. And we were very lucky here that we have a lot of folks who lived through South African experience, and we've heard a lot about that. We have professor level folks, in the lives as well. I'm just curious if there's any other examples that you can share, and perhaps create a post in the future so that it's just kind of sitting there that describes, what can we do? What changes and what direction can we make, towards finding some level of a solution?
Yeah, it's so thinking about possible solutions for the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's interesting day to bring that up because so today's last day of classes for the semester, and one of the classes that was on Fridays was my Israel-Palestine class. So the last day today was just an open discussion on possible solutions. So we went around and everyone said, "Well, what do you prefer?" So we went there. There's like I know what was it? I don't know, 7 or 8 different major models that were out there that people talked about, and they mentioned which one they supported and why, and people brought up different things that they saw as obstacles to it. The but things like that, it's difficult because there are so many barriers for all of them. Like there's no single great model in terms of being achievable. And honestly, the one that I tend to favor the most may be the most difficult to achieve, but it has the best long-term potential for working. But none of them are easy. I think the single biggest thing people can do, especially in diaspora, is deal with uh, their own societies and why they are willing to turn a blind eye to issues like this. What can they do there? How can we improve the situation here? There's a lot of like U.S. popular culture and politics are just fucked on this issue. So there's a lot of work that has to happen there because without that, it's impossible to put the kind of pressure needed on an Israeli state to change. The the long term prognosis for where they're headed right now. I mean, there are two basic possibilities as an outcome for where they're going without significant intervention. One is successful genocide. And that doesn't have to mean, unaliving everybody. It could mean simply driving them all out, because that has the same basic effect. Once a population is completely dispersed from its homeland, over generations, it slowly loses its connection to and memory of a homeland and loses its identity. And people will just assimilate into the various societies that they landed in. There are countless examples of nations that have ceased to exist that way. Nations, again, sense of people, a sense of common identity. So the Palestinian people as a distinct people will eventually cease to exist if they're fully driven out of their homeland. And that's one of the reasons that it's such an important strategic objective for a lot of Israeli governments. The other is that the population stays and they continue to reproduce and they're still on the land. They aren't chased out. And then these kind of policies stay in place. But in the long run, because the birth rate is higher for Palestinians, you eventually have them greatly outnumbering Israelis within the territory that they have sovereign control over. And then you end up with, at best, a South Africa style collapse because the rest of the world is not going to tolerate it when you're dealing with an overwhelming majority of the population kept in apartheid conditions. And at that point, it would cease to be a recognizably Jewish state either. It would just become Palestine. It would collapse outright. So it's either going to be a one state Israel or a one state Palestine, in essence. through a very chaotic, bloody, horrifying process. None of this is good. And you're talking about another century plus of horrifying conditions to get to either of these. So I'm not happy about any of that. All of the other possibilities, they all require significant international pressure. Um, there are a lot of people on the ground already trying to change attitudes. Trying to um, push for more nonviolent resistance methods because that'll appeal in the world, and et cetera. Or there's pushing for like solidarity groups and resistance groups inside Israel. There's tons of Israelis that are in the West Bank and Gaza all the time trying to like document what's going on and interacting with people. There are a lot of people on the ground that are trying to make it better, but the way the system is structured, they cannot do it on their own. And they've been losing ground instead of gaining it, which means you need a lot of force from the outside. So I think if you're looking for what can we do as a single biggest thing, it's change our own attitudes, change our own understandings, get people in our own society to understand that these people have to find a way to get along. We have to get over the bullshit ethno-nationalisms. For the United States case, and for like Canada, like another country that recently voted to fully endorse everything that's going on right now. I mean, some of the countries that are worst on these issues, the single most important thing you can do is help people understand that Israel is an ethnocracy. It's not a normal liberal democracy. People have bought the myth that it's just a liberal democracy and the only democracy in the Middle East, and therefore something worth supporting. But hey, South Africa was a democracy too. It was just a democracy only for a specific group of people. So I mean, if you can help people to understand that we're supporting an ethnocracy, it can start to erode some of the blanket support that's there and eventually um, turn a corner, I guess. Anyway, that's sort of a long-winded answer. I think that the key is really it's in the diaspora. It's in the countries all around the world, not in Israel, Palestine, that we can most do things.
No, I appreciate that. So really, this is a very special case in history, and all I can take
Mm-hmm.
from things that have gone on in the past and apply them here. There's really not a whole lot that we can say, oh, here's a very similar situation, and this is how it
Right.
played out. Okay, thank you, Doctor.
There are some similarities here and there, but there's nothing that's as strong because the single biggest thing we got to deal with, and this is one of the things that makes it most complicated to deal with in Europe or in North America, where you're trying to push these societies to change their attitudes. It's the long term generational trauma of the Jewish people that becomes a problem. The culpability for anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. Europeans have 1900 years of guilt over this because they treated Jews like absolute shit, and arguably still do in many ways. And that's a significant part of U.S. history too. We have had a lot of anti-Semites in the White House, um, and I think instead of actually dealing with the problems, instead of actually examining the racism that caused that, the way that a lot of societies have managed this is projecting it outward in terms of like, well, we'll just support Israel and that will take care of our guilt. We'll support Israel, we'll let them do it, and they're there and they can do their thing over there, and we don't have to deal with the fact that we are racist pieces of shit. So what you in order to deal with it, you have to not only get people to reckon with our own history of racism, but help people understand that this doesn't actually help, and that ultimately this kind of blind support for a Zionist ethnocracy is deeply harmful to the Jewish people. It is causing major resurgences in anti-Semitism. It's it it seriously imperils Jewish lives. It's a terrible, terrible solution. As a solution. So by proceeding this way, it's kind of self-defeating, but it'll be hard to get people to understand that, because the reason that we ended up in this situation in the first place is it's simply easier for people to blindly support Israel instead of actually dealing with the real sources of their guilt, which is, the history of racism and Christian supremacy. I think that's what makes it very distinctive in terms of like not having other historical examples.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I'll drop out now and give somebody else a chance.
Well, it's a pretty slow night, looks like. And given 5.5 hours in the car, I don't know how much energy I'll have tonight anyway. But one neat thing for anybody that is watching here that worth keeping in mind is that for a few weeks, I'll actually have a lot more time. I still have plenty of work to do, but I don't have to commute down the hill. And normally, the reason I won't do things like this in the evenings is I have to get up at 4 a.m. for work, for the commutes. But if I don't have to drive down the hill, then I can sleep in a little bit. So I'm fine. uh, so you'll probably see a lot more of me in the next few weeks. So I can pop on a little bit, on quite a few nights. So if this night isn't as long as some of these have been, just know you'll see me maybe tomorrow night again. You'll see me during the week, this coming week, because I'm not going anywhere. So I'll be around. Oh, hello, Be Blessed. Ah, good. Good to see you.
You sounded like you had a nightmare drive today.
Yeah, there was a bunch of rubberneckers. There was some work being done along the side of the road, but it was way up close to where I would have to get off. So it was most of my commute was horrifying. Yeah, it should on a Friday if I leave right when classes finish, 3.5 hours at best. This was 5.5, so it's kind of like.
I've got a question that I think is interesting from the comments that says, why is it difficult for a revolution to happen in the US, whereas in other countries have done a lot?
Why is it difficult for a revolution to happen here?
Yes.
Well, that is a giant question, actually. It's one that I got really interested in for a while, just because studying revolutions is interesting as a whole. It's one of the things that ultimately got me to write the class on the Arab revolutions too. But big things like Mexican Revolution, French Revolution, Russian Revolution were always fascinating. The, uh, there's a lot of things that go into revolutions. You have to have quite a few things all lined up in order to make them happen at all. And then, even if you can get one to spring up here, then the bigger question is, would it succeed? And given the massive amount of firepower we've given to this government, that's kind of iffy. But you need like an intellectual class with a bunch of ideas to kind of like shape things. You need a whole bunch of really really angry people. You need a permissive international climate. You need a crisis to take advantage of. There's a whole lot of things that have to fall into place all at once for that to kind of happen. And we have had at quite a few different points in U.S. history some of the features falling in place. Large scale popular anger, or various crises that could have turned into things. There's been a lot of places where we've had some of the 5 or 6 factors that you'd kind of need to happen all at once, but never all of them. Short of a few crazy things like the U.S. Civil War, which is kind of one. Yeah. But yeah, I think honestly, at the end of the day, the fact that we've given so much power to this government, and that we have integrated the US so much into an international power consensus. So it would be difficult to get that permissive climate. Like, would the rest of the world tolerate a revolution in the US, or would they spring into action to support it? I mean, hell, think about the way NATO works. If there's a significant uprising in the US, even if you manage to get ahead of the military or get a bunch of the military on the side of it, they could just invoke the NATO charter and bring everybody else into it. I mean, it's really really complicated. I think in the U.S. the single best bet we've got is more the the socio-political revolutions, like changing our attitudes and then changing our government. Like you're reforming the government, rather than outright overthrowing the state. I honestly don't think that there's any real chance of it. I think any attempt to it is bound to end up in just a turkey shoot for the military. So it's okay. It's not a lot of
Um,
space here for you, but hey, bud.
Given that the US has vetoed another ceasefire, what are your thoughts on
Finish off your bike.
the UN and I guess its part in both this and future? And I hate to use the word conflict, but I'll use the word conflict in this because I can't think of another point. But yeah, what are your thoughts on the UN in general, and do you see it continuing to exist? Is there a likelihood that it's now on its dying days? What is your
Oh no,
thoughts on the UN in general?
it's way too useful. Hey, got it. It's way too useful to go away. Um, we have to remember that the UN is not a world government, and that it actually doesn't have a free hand to act really in any situation. It was created by a superpower consensus to support those superpowers. It's hey, what are you doing? Get up there. Okay. Um, uh, it's um, it doesn't really represent the views of most of the world in a kind of like fair way. It was never designed to do so. This is why General Assembly resolutions have no relevance really other than like moral force, I guess, if that counts for anything. But they're not enforceable in any way. Only Security Council resolutions are, and in the Security Council, 5 powers have a veto. So yeah, and which kind of countries are those? It's not like
By those 5 countries and how to overcome the current situation? It seems like we have a deadlock with the US.
well, yeah, we and it's why the UN was completely useless throughout the entire anti-colonial struggle because Britain and France have a veto. Um, it's never been especially useful at fighting conflicts. It has failed repeatedly to have any productive role in conflicts in the world. Uh, no one wanted to ratify the proposed part of the charter that would have given it actual operational command of military forces. So any military forces that get deployed, any blue helmets that show up out there, they're always under the command of the country that contributed them. So if, say, I don't know, South Korea doesn't want a shooting war, it can say, don't shoot no matter what, and then just let things happen right in front of them, which has happened plenty of times. So they oftentimes have extremely restricted ambits when they even are on the ground. It's more of a moral force, like just standing there. In the same way that like completely disarmed police can have an effect, but if there's a really significant conflict brewing, like a genocide, say like I don't know, a Rwanda or this or that, there's nothing really they can do to stop it because no one is going to allow them to do anything about it. The system was built that way intentionally, though. It was designed to actually lock in the power of these major players. This is one of the reasons I often find it hilarious that a lot of the American right wants to pull out of the UN, because the UN is a great advantage to us. It's basically a tool to provide legitimacy. But when it wants to say something that we don't like, we can just ignore it. But when we want to use it, we can, and it can add moral weight to an argument. But that's really it. The UN is useful in the same way that international law is useful. Neither of them are really useful, but they both have a kind of moral relevance at times. They can be used to support certain arguments, but you can't actually count on them for enforcement of something. The UN cannot enforce anything that it really wants to do unless the US itself already wants that thing. If the US doesn't want it, then the UN can't do a damn thing, and it's never been able to. But I don't think it's going away because it's super useful to all these major powers. It always has been, and it does provide a forum where countries can talk. So a lot of the smaller players do enjoy the ability to engage, to interact with each other, to build coalitions. So it is broadly useful to the entire world, not just to the superpowers. It's just not useful for conflicts and never has been.
Kimberly, I think it's you who's next
Right.
for the question.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Liam. Hope you're having a great evening tonight. I have a question, and that question was, why do you think, like, this is just me speculating. I know that with regards to Germany, because I'm Afro-German, so I know that with regards to Germany, the reason as to why the German government is so loyal to the Israeli state is because of World War II, the guilt that the dominant society feels because of World War II, which is it's kind of trying to cleanse itself of that guilt through Islamophobia and Arab phobia. So I get that part. I just don't understand as to why so many Western governments are so vehemently pro the Israeli government without being pro Jewish people. Because I know that Jewish communities within Europe are treated abysmally,
Mhm.
not listened to. Synagogues have to be protected with the police.
Mhm.
Anti Semitic attacks, even prior to October the 7th, were always bad. So, seeing, for example, in Germany, before this, I'm going to be long winded, but kind of want to explain where I'm coming from.
Okay.
Before October the 7th, there was a huge scandal that happened with regards to a lot of police networks within Germany being neo-Yazis and spreading a lot of anti-Semitic rhetoric. And
Yep.
when they were caught, the German government decided not to prosecute them, not to fire them, because it was just humor. Dark humor is what it was labeled in the case. And so there is a clear lack of care for Jewish communities within Europe.
Yep.
But then at the same time, there's this so pro Israel stance, which to me is just, I'm wondering if it's because of lobbying groups that are pro Zionism. Is it because of um, colonial projects have always supported other colonial projects? Um, or is it because of the guilt of World War II? But if it's because of the guilt of World War II, why aren't Jewish communities treated well in Europe?
Yeah, it's not just World War II. And that's not even the case really even just for Germany. Um, the key for a lot of it is it's a way of deflecting away from having to examine that history of racism. The Not only does Europe have to deal with the 19th and 20th century anti-Semitism that still continues, the literally racist nationalist aspect of it, it also has to deal with the anti-Judaism that's been there since the rise of Christianity, and the atrocities that have been relatively commonplace since the second century. Um, Instead of dealing with the fact that Christianity has a problem with Judaism, since Christianity is part of Europe's identity, and instead of dealing with the fact that they have this racist, nationalist sensibility, around the nation state, that nationalism itself excludes Jews and causes that racism, rather than actually dealing with those ideologies, instead they think that support for Israel cleanses them of it. It's a way of trying to expunge the guilt without actually dealing with the problem. So it's ultimately harmful. This is why Jewish communities can still be treated like shit, because there's no examination of what causes that. European societies are generally unwilling to look deeply into themselves and realize why this existed in the first place. Why was this hatred there? Why or something? So instead, this is a way of cheating, I guess. They can think, oh, because I support Israel, clearly I'm not anti Semitic. Look, I support Israel. Meanwhile, a synagogue is burning behind you. You're just not paying attention. So
Yeah,
it's cheating.
Yeah, the gag is that like in German media now, there's this idea of an imported anti-Semitism. And so that to me is just very, very hilarious. Like there are talks like when you hear politicians, like German politicians referring to this, they call it an imported anti-Semitism, trying to basically blame Turkish Germans or
Yeah,
anybody who isn't a white German
right.
for the issue of anti-Semitism within Germany. And so it is just so frustrating to see all of this, especially
It,
with the restrictions of freedom of speech, I think.
I think it's one of the reasons that I always spend time talking about the religious aspect and not just the nationalist one, because until people really grapple with how deeply intertwined anti-Judaism and Christianity are,
Mm.
it's very difficult to deal with this stuff. And just like the Vatican saying, "Oh well, we forgive the Jews. We don't think that they killed all the that we don't think they killed Christ anymore." But whatever. Like, see, you've got the church finally saying that in the '60s. This, I mean, ignores the fact that a whole bunch of other churches never changed their position on that. But it also doesn't change the underlying attitudes. The fact that the texts themselves are problematic, that the history is problematic, that everywhere you look, you're going to find elements of Christian iconography that are deeply anti-Jewish. There's a
Mm.
ton of stuff that's just there. We really forget the degree to which a lot of the participants in what the Yazis did in the 30s and 40s happened because of anti-Judaism, not because of anti-Semitism. A lot of the people who participated did it just because they grew up, and as good Catholics or Lutherans, of course they hate the Jews, and we're fine going along with that because atrocities were just normal for most of European history. So
Mhm.
of course it's still going to continue to the present because there's been no deep self-examination. They haven't really dealt with the flaws in Christianity that caused this, and they
Mm.
certainly haven't dealt also with the basic model of the nation state, because as long as you're arguing that a country like this government exists for this particular ethnic group, and then that leaves it kind of open ended because I don't know if you guys know this, but race and ethnicity and nation are all flexible social constructs that don't really
Yes.
mean anything in biology.
Yeah.
So if you say the German nation, that means one thing to one person and something to somebody else. So for my friends in the German Afghan community in Bonn, they're German as fuck. Like they are
Mm.
super German. And for them, the German nation includes them. But for the descendants of the Yazis that still live there, they don't think that includes them.
Mm.
They still want a blood definition that hasn't really gone away. So they can hold to that as an ideal and say that these people aren't really German. And that would include Jews too. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if most people know this, but it wasn't until the 19th century that Jews were citizens anywhere in Europe. They were
Yeah.
never, they were just tolerated alien presences. Um, the first one is, I guess, what, 1803, I think, in France, and then it's in the 1880s or 1890s the last countries, like a
Mm.
few of the ones in the Balkans finally do it. It's slowly spreading across the 19th century, slowly extending citizenship, and every country that happened, it was opposed by significant parts of the population. And a good part of what
Mm.
we saw in terms of the violence of the 20th century, including the Yazis, are actually a response to extending citizenship to them. Because suddenly people had to be like, well, I don't want those people living next to me. Oh, there goes the
Mm.
neighborhood, that kind of crap. So they joined reactionary movements. It's similar to it in the US when they started trying to roll back discrimination laws. And, suddenly black Americans are able to move into neighborhoods. And next thing you know, people are putting on hoods. So it's the same basic dynamic. Um, but while the US still hasn't dealt with a lot of that, the Europeans haven't either. The Europeans have never really reckoned with the fact that nationalism is inherently racist, and
Mhm.
nationalism inherently excludes groups like Jews and Muslims because they're not part of the traditional Christian identity that they start with. So
I think it's so fascinating because
supporting Israel
Mikhail,
just gives you a way out of that.
Yeah, Mikhail Budaman, who is a social scientist, actually refers to um, like how Jewish people are weaponized within German kind of memory and society. He calls it a Gedächtnistheater or a memory theater. And so he says it's kind of like once a year, like every year, like Jewish people are just brought out and then they kind of like say, oh, look at us. We find pride in the shame of doing this to Jewish people. And then it's kind of like a theater. And then they kind of like put them back in and they're like, we don't care about your other contemporary issues, right? And Max Cholek, who is also a Jewish German social scientist, but also lyricist, actively talks about how Jewish communities are weaponized by the dominant society. So when it comes to combating Turkish Germans or anybody who is not white, all of a sudden Germany is a Judeo-Christian country. When it comes to there was this incident where a bunch of schools and kindergartens decided to not offer pork and offer only like kosher and halal food for the Jewish and Muslim children. And there was this outrage in German politics. This is a Christian country. Everybody should be adapting to it. So it's like this shift between Judeo-Christian when Jewish people are being weaponized against Muslims, and
Right.
then Christian when people are saying let's
Exactly.
hate Jewish people and Muslim people. So
Yep.
it's just very, very disheartening. And especially like I
Right.
work at a museum. I'm an academic, but I also work at a museum, and I've been kind of forced to co-sign the museum's complete support for the Israeli government because of how German politics right now is set up.
Yeah.
And any support for Palestinians is labeled anti-Semitic. So it was
Right.
just very disheartening. Sorry for
Yeah.
the long-winded answer or
I,
question. It just, yeah, just
I, I,
frustrating.
I completely feel you on the on how frustrating that is. There's been a lot of pushback and fighting in the university system here too, to prevent us from having to go along with crap like that, because administrations have been wanting to do things like that, and a lot of the faculty are not having it. But it's a very, very contentious issue. The But yeah, in bringing up the sociologist, you're kind of like you're hitting the issue squarely in the forehead there, because it's at the end of the day, Euro-American society never dealt with its own racism, never dealt with its own history of settler colonialism, never dealt with its own history of anti-Semitism. It's just never addressed it. It's just said, well, we're over that now, and we're over that now because we support Israel. It's a crutch.
Yeah.
It allows us to avoid those very difficult, painful self-examinations and the social transformation that would be necessary. And instead allows us very easily to latch onto something that we can relate to, i.e., a violent settler colonial project. So it's there when people fall into a lot of, and this stuff really, really bothers me. When people start falling back on those old conspiracies. I saw a moment ago there was a reference. I didn't see the whole comment, but somebody made a reference to the protocols of the elders of Zion.
Oh
Um,
gosh.
I still see references all the time, and it's really disheartening to see Muslims, American and European Muslims, using the same kind of old anti-Semitic tropes about Jews controlling the media and politics and pulling all the puppet strings of politicians and whatnot, because that's simply not true. It's simply that they have shared interests. When those interests diverge, the politicians in these countries will perfectly well steamroll any Jewish people, just like they always had. They don't care. At the end of the day, it's nothing to do with Jews. It's a shared interest. As long as it aligns with those interests and it gives something to these countries, the U.S. will support Israel because it gives Americans something. APAC, somebody's asking there, is one of a bazillion lobby groups, and tons of the ones that actually support the Israel issue are not APAC. There's a whole bunch of other ones here that are aligned with Christian churches that do exactly the same work APAC does. APAC allows an introduction of a Jewish voice into the discussion in Washington, but it doesn't dominate it. It doesn't control the elections. The reason that APAC is powerful is because Christian Zionism already existed here. And I think a lot of people forget that Christian Zionism is actually older than Jewish Zionism. The desire to get the Jews to go back there started among Christians that wanted an apocalypse. It kind of like um, it overlaps in interest. They're a major contributor because they're useful. They fit into a broader framework. If they were asking our politicians to do something that no one else wanted, then they wouldn't have any relevance. I mean, we can raise a whole bunch of money for some cause that nobody likes. You're still not going to be able to buy the politicians because they understand the way all the other interest groups and all their different voters are going to work. It wouldn't work. You'd walk in with the checks and people would be like, no thanks. Or they would take the check and then never actually support the legislation. AIPAC is powerful because its interests align with a whole bunch of other things. It's never as
Interest
simple as
convergence.
one little factor like that. But I see a lot of people leaning on things like AIPAC or all that kind of stuff as if it explains everything. It's one part of a much more complex ecosystem.
It's interest convergence. That's why a lot of companies tend to
Yep.
pink wash during LGBTQ plus months, Pride months as well. It's not necessarily because they care about these marginalized communities; it's because of interest
Right.
convergence.
Right, exactly.
But one thing I wanted to
Yeah.
ask, I know I've asked so many questions. I always do this. What do you think of people like Norman Finkelstein or Miko Peled and Judith Butler, who have been very vocal about this, especially Miko Peled coming from a deeply Zionist family? I think his grandfather literally signed the Declaration of Independence for Israel. And now he's very, very vocal anti-Israel critic. So, and Norman Finkelstein has wrote countless books as well about how even Jewish trauma is weaponized by Israel and other countries. So what do you think about these academics as well, and Judith Butler as well, who I personally
Yeah.
love myself?
Yeah, Finkelstein's book on the Holocaust industry still rubs people the wrong way too. So yeah, it's interesting. I think on some level, um, I'm on some level I can connect to that because I mean I don't know, like, so I'll read his books, but on another level I kind of move in different circles in the sense that I don't pay as much attention to the activism that they're doing. Um, but that's true in a lot of respects. I generally don't have time to follow a whole bunch of different podcasts and what everyone's doing and whatnot. So I'm sure they say tons and tons of stuff and do tons and tons of speaking things that I never hear about. But when they do put out articles, I'll read the article or the book or whatever. I'll read the books, and then I hear about things that they're saying or doing in various activist circles and different speaking tours and whatnot. I think one of the things that would stand out for me a little bit on it, at least, is that, and this is a tough one here, especially since my own approach to this has had to change over the years because I used to be a lot more optimistic about finding ways to get people to work together, but I've gotten a lot more violently angry, I guess, in the last decade than I used to be. But I think on some level when people phrase things in the more caustically you put things, the more it's kind of like a handout to your enemies. I had one of my friends and an advisor in my own dissertation is another activist on this issue. I don't know if anybody runs into Mark Levine at all. He writes for Al Jazeera. But when the initial attack happened on the 7th and they broke through the barricades and pushed in, his first statements were, "It's about time," like kind of cheering it on. And then when the scale of it hit, there was such a fantastic backlash against him for that. Now I get why he said it because yeah, it's a giant outdoor prison. It's bombed almost every single year. It's horrifying conditions. You kind of get why people would lash out, but the problem is the way that the rhetoric plays in certain circles, and it can actually harm the cause overall. It's a delicate balance. You want to be able to push forcefully enough to bring the issue to the fore so people really understand, yes, this is a violent settler colony. Yes, this is apartheid. Yes, this is a really fucked up situation. But do it in a way that doesn't allow someone to weaponize your words to harm the cause. And I think that Mark falls into that sometimes. I think that Norman falls into that sometimes. I think there's a number of people that they're through some careless phrasing, they actually help the Zionists. And that I think bothers me a little bit because I get where Norman's coming from. I understand what he's talking about and why he's angry. I get it. I've seen it. I have spent time with a lot of people. I've couch surfed through tons of refugee camps and you know, talked with tons of people about how they live and seen this shit. I know how fucked it is. But the if you approach it in too impolitical way, it can often push people away. It can alienate the very people that you need to convert. So it's a very delicate balance there. It's a tough balancing act. And I realize I'm saying that as somebody that I often stumble over my own words. I mean I'm still autistic as fuck. I often say things badly, but at least I'm aware of how that's problematic. And so yeah, it's I guess that's my long-winded answer there is like I respect what people like Norman are doing, but I'm sometimes like taken aback at how forcefully he'll say something because I know how it's going to be heard by exactly the people that we need to reach.
I would argue that any act of resistance is viewed as disrespectful. Like historically, when we look at
Sure.
even former colonized people, regardless if they did it peacefully, if they non-violently protested, if they violently protested, any act of resistance will be seen as disrespectful by the status quo that wants to stay the status quo. So I think,
Right, but
like,
that's distinct from having conversations within the outside society. You know,
mhm,
the resistance there, yeah, of course, that can be spun in any different way. And where we can differ on the strategic value of different things,
mhm,
that's sort of a separate question from when somebody is giving public lectures on a topic, right?
mhm,
And you want to bring people in. It's I guess the approach I tend to take is I don't know, some of it's the whole like you attract more flies with honey than vinegar kind of thing. Like you want to find a way to make it easier for people to get through it because you have a lot of psychological resistance. People have deeply ingrained belief systems that tell them la
mhm,
la 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 la, I can't hear this Palestine shit. This is harmful. I can't hear this. And they'll dig in their heels. And when you like throw at them really forcefully a particular idea, it makes it very easy for that to predominate. Where um if you it's possible, and I've done this repeatedly. Like I've had a lot of Zionist kids in my Israel Palestine class, and I've been doing that class for 15 years. I've only had one student in that entire time that finished the class still fully committed to his ideas and still thinking that Israel all the way. You know, it's if you find a way uh, to bring people to it on their own, to to lay out the pieces in such a way that they can find their way to it and it makes sense and they can realize, oh yeah, I'm holding to a really fucked up idea here, then you actually change their minds. And if you change enough minds, then we can change policy. If you change policy here, then we can change policy there. But when you hit people with things in such a way that they have an ability psychologically to dig their heels in and not hear you at all, then all you're going to get is the same ditto head rhetoric. You guys, I'm sure a ton of you have seen everyone repeating the same, oh, they use human shields, or they have like certain lines that they'll just keep using. They're never going to examine what that really means. And the reason it works for them is they never had to humanize the other side. I mean, realistically, gosh, if there's a human shield, you still don't shoot through the kid. I mean, that's just like that's humanity 101. It doesn't make sense. But it works for them because they've never actually humanized the other side of this. You have to find a way to do that for them to really see the complexity of this situation. So I guess that's my view on it, because I get where you're coming from in terms of like, yeah, people are always going to be resistant to this, but if the point is to change minds, that's a little different than per se like getting the governments to accept things. Because yeah, government at the end of the day doesn't care if it's nonviolent or violent resistance. Honestly, the Israelis have frequently violently targeted nonviolent protesters in the same way that the US government targeted nonviolent protesters here, and the South African government targeted nonviolent protesters there. Nonviolent protesters are in many ways more of a threat to the status quo than violent ones are, and they know that. So the government isn't going to change its mind one way or the other. It's fine. It doesn't care which strategy you use. But ordinary people often do. And if you're trying to change minds, reaching ordinary people in a way that meets them where they are and helps them to find their way to this, I think is more beneficial in the long run in terms of changing minds.
What's up, Liam?
Please, you're third in line. Khalili first, Francisco, then yourself, if you don't
Yeah,
mind.
that's fine. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
Oh,
Khalili, you're next in line to ask your
thank
question.
you. Thank you. Be
No problem.
blessed.
Thanks for
How
being
you
patient.
doing? Liam? Yeah, no problem. I could listen to you all night, Liam. I'm a I like when you speak. I learn a lot from you. I have a lot of questions. I guess my main one would be, what are your thoughts? Like, what would be the ramifications from? You guys were talking about the UN earlier, USA veto. Sorry, is this better?
Yeah,
Yeah,
do you want to ask the
yeah.
question again?
You just went silent for a minute.
Okay, sorry. So yeah, I was talking about like, wanted to pick your brain a little bit. Like, do you think there will be international ramifications from the veto? Because, like you said, it's just like a moral suggestion, right? The UN. So, do you think that's what the USA wants? They want their and they're ready for what would come from it, like the precedent they're sending with vetoing what they did today, for example.
Given how many times we've done very, very similar things, uh, no, there won't be any negative consequences, and I think that's why they know they can get away with it. Um, there have been countless situations where the U.S. has been the only one standing in the way of stopping major bloodshed somewhere in the world. Um, uh, it is distressingly common. The only way we can really make progress in a lot of these issues, and this is where I love to seeing a lot of cross-border solidarity in different issues. Just like I like seeing a lot of the intersectional type discussions. The more you can bring people together, the more we can keep these issues in the public eye and not forget about them. Because tons of previous cases, the U.S. has stepped up, vetoed something. The atrocities have carried on long after, much longer than they should have, and then we all eventually forget that it even happened, and that always leaves me kind of sad. I don't think the U.S. is going to face any significant repercussions in terms of its, trade status, politics, anything else.
Well, I meant more like, uh, um, it's kind of like setting a precedent. So, like, what if somebody, say Russia or China, gets the idea like, okay, well, the world stayed silent while you allowed Israel to do this. What if they get a creative idea of doing something? Like right now, we saw Venezuela is trying to take Guyana or something for their natural resources. And do you think it'll just like keep carrying on till it like explode? Like,
Well,
just
they already do. That's where I guess the only thing I'm pushing back on is just the concept of a precedent, because from my perspective, the precedent already exists. Were there any real consequences to what they did in Chechnya? Are there any real consequences for what the Chinese did in Tibet? You know that in Tibet today, Han Chinese outnumber Tibetans. That genocide is well advanced. And you go back further beyond that. I mean, the Manchu genocide has already succeeded. The Manchu people don't exist anymore. They've been Sinified. You know, they're outnumbered vastly in their homeland by Han Chinese settlers, and the ones who were still there, they've lost their indigenous culture. But there's no there's no consequence because these are major powers, and major powers tend to get away with whatever they want. And if you're a big enough power, you can fold somebody else in under that umbrella, which is what the U.S. does frequently with Israel. But the Russians and the Chinese have done a little bit of that with other players as well. So I think that, yeah, it's very similar to tons of other cases where other players have vetoed resolutions that would have stopped violence somewhere else when it's in the interests of those great powers to let that violence play out. The rest of the world can scream and pull their hair, but there's not a whole lot they can really do about it because of the structure of these international organizations.
Okay,
I don't,
yeah.
I don't know if that helps, but I mean, it's
No,
depressing.
yeah.
It's
I just don't
depressing,
know one.
but I think the precedent already exists. Is the sad part. Oh, oh,
And yes,
he keeps cutting his mic out. Are you there?
Oh, I think he said he was done.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Okay,
Okay, cool.
brilliant. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Yeah, good here.
Francisco, are you there?
Yes.
No, Francisco first, I
Oh,
believe, and then I'll come to you, Frank.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I just it was interesting what you were saying about the language around people understanding and keeping them on side with the way that you approach the information, which is what me and my group have been trying to do since the start, is not using the inflammatory language so that it gets thrown back on you so that you lose the argument, which I've forgotten the document and the approach that the Israeli government took after the Lebanon war, where they realized, okay, we've lost the people, we've lost the support, so now we need to try and gaslight into everyone that every time we do something bad, that we can get their support for doing that with the settlers. So it's the step by step process on, how to use language and how to approach the media and turn events to keep people supportive. So are you able to speak on that and just kind of elaborate on, how, language is really important so that when we're in situations like this, it's the using facts and not the emotions, because if you do come from that like emotional
Oh,
status, it does get twisted and kind of thrown back at people, which it is. It's obviously it's extremely hard when you've got a situation like this to be able to remove that and to keep. Like I've seen so many amazing community leaders like being torn apart by anchor people and staying composed and calm and sticking to their facts, their information. And I just think, wow, like they're amazing people to be able to handle that and
yeah.
to just not lose their mind and retaliate and react, which is, it's what they want. They want that retaliation and to go, see, this is a bad person right here. But
Yeah,
yeah.
there's one thing I want to add a little bit of nuance to the question of emotion at least. And then I think I can use that to lead into an example of how framing can work. Um, one thing that's useful to keep in mind. Oh,
Um,
sure.
I just wanted to interject because there's a question from the comments that I think can also be included in your response, which was um, something that's been mentioned a couple of times about 3 or 3.5% shift in attitudes can make a difference. Is there a way that you could just elaborate on that in the question that Francesco asked?
Um, I, if I'm under,
Or if it's a separate
pardon me.
one, we can deal with it later.
If I'm understanding it right, the I could hit that very simply. Leading into this is you can read a tipping point. Is that once support for a particular idea begins to grow, it gets easier and easier to make those arguments because something seems less and less fringe. So even a small shift can actually create a tidal wave of difference. And there's other ways it also can affect things too. Hey, you know what? Jeez, Steve. um, but yeah, that's um, just getting every little bit helps is the point there, because you start to bring an idea out and make it normal, and next thing you know, it's suddenly like a flood. I don't know. Look at I don't know, tons of polling of Americans. You go back before Bernie's 2016 run, and support for single payer health insurance was practically dead here. But now even a majority of Republicans would support the idea. It just depends on how you ask them. So it's just getting out and talking about the idea can rapidly change the discussions. For the question of emotion on it, there's places where, and I know why you're raising it here, so it's more like a sense of nuance than actually a quibble with it, because when you're addressing things, being able to not argue from emotion in a sense can often be advantageous. If somebody looks like you're just screaming about something, then they're going to tune you out. But there's places where I think it's very helpful to understand that people have different moral sensibilities, and somebody can be arguing in a way that you find like just deeply, deeply immoral. But for them, there is a morality to what they're doing, and it makes sense to understand what that is. And moral framing often uses emotion. If you can, if you can understand what that moral framework is within which somebody works, and then frame your rhetoric in a way that you touch their emotions in a way that works for them, I think it's very helpful. So somebody who say is already going to be sympathetic to Palestine because, hey, blowing up kids is bad, and we kind of, I think, mostly would agree with that in this chat. But not everyone would. So for us, saying, hey, look, blowing up babies is bad, and we can all get emotional about it, we can talk about it, and we'll be able to commiserate, we'll understand each other. But somebody that is operating within a different moral paradigm, that's not going to work in the same way. But emotions can still reach them. And if you reach somebody's emotions, it can open them up in a sense. It can open up their heart in a way and help them to change. But to do that, you have to understand what emotional language would work for them, what moral language works for them. And there are differences. So I guess that's the nuance I'd want to add there. Emotion can be very useful, but only in ways that you want to target it at people's very specific emotional frameworks so that they can use it, so that they can find a way to do it. Because with almost anybody, you can find a way to help them to care, but they have different things that get in the way of that. I don't know. Look at one of the kind of archetypal examples of this for many people that have a more conservative or reactionary mentality. An issue won't be real to them until they have a way to relate to it. So look at Dick Cheney suddenly changed his positions on LGBTQ matters because of his daughter, and he bucked his party on that. He's still a horrifying Darth Vader-esque human being, but on that issue, he disagreed with the rest of his party for pretty early on because of his daughter. It made it real to him. He had an emotional connection with her that allowed her to bring the issue to him. So oftentimes it's a matter of finding what technique would work with people, and then if you can play on that, you can connect to them in a way that can help them to find their own heart and find, oh yeah, shit, I guess this is a bad idea, we shouldn't do that anymore. But it can be very difficult to reach everybody there. As far as a neat example of framing, one that I've often used, and this is just me coming out of the left and living in rural areas where I'm generally surrounded by conservatives. I've had a lot of political conversations over the years with people, and I have found that I have been able to get a ton of people who are dyed-in-the-wool Republicans or right libertarians, like Big L Libertarian Party type people. So right-wingers to straight up endorse socialist policies. But I do it by avoiding certain language. You don't walk out there saying, "Hi, you want to be a socialist, and here's why," because they've been conditioned to associate the S word with Stalin and everything else, and blah blah blah. And it doesn't really work. But if you start talking about what the ideas really mean for them, like how it affects their lives, how it affects their businesses, because oftentimes people around you have no idea what these things even mean. Like how many people have any idea what the fuck capitalism even is? I could not tell you how many people I've had run into me that's like, well, I have my own plumbing company, so I'm a capitalist. Like, bro, no, you're not. You may be a supporter of capitalism, but you're not a capitalist. A capitalist is the person making the investments. Capitalism is an investment model. Market economics and having businesses, we've had that for thousands of years. Capitalism is 5 centuries old. So if you can help them understand, no, your business isn't really, I don't care about that. That's not the issue here at all. But there's this other thing. And you find ways to help them see, like, this can actually advantage them, that this can give them a better quality of life without taking away their freedoms. Um, so oftentimes it's a matter of like using the term. So when I was thinking about it, like emotion earlier, right? How can you reach them? So freedom is a word that's like deeply ingrained in a lot of the right wing consciousness in the U.S., which honestly I find hilarious because so many of their politics are about taking freedom from people. But whatever, the word freedom is super super important for them, and it hits them on an emotional level. If you can find a way to show them that, say, single payer healthcare, gives them more freedom, because it would, or limiting capitalism would actually give them more freedom because it could. Um, but everything about the overall rhetorical frameworks that they run into tells them that's not the case. But they love freedom. They're super psyched on freedom. So tie it into it, or like tax cuts. They love tax cuts for some reason, right? And the problem here is, like, they want a tax cut, and okay, I get that. I'd like a tax cut too. I think that we should eat the rich, but that's a whole different issue. They should be taxed out of existence, but I think working people should pay a lot less in taxes. So, so meet them on that. So it's like, yeah, I agree with you. You should have lower taxes, and here's some of the ways that you can have lower taxes. One of the ways you can have lower taxes, and I can show you statistically how this works. Your taxes started going up because we cut taxes on the rich. So people had to make it up at the municipal and state level, so they started raising taxes. So you got screwed because we wanted to give Bezos a tax cut. Another one is, like, you show them specific policies, like, here's how you can reframe something like Medicare for All as a tax cut, because it literally would be. Um, I mean, yeah, I would pay an extra 12 grand to a government program, but I would save 10 grand in cash that I'm paying out to a private insurer. That's $9,000 in my pocket. That's a tax cut. But you don't think of it that way because it's being taxed by an employer in a corporation and not the government. So they count on that distinction, but at the end of the day, it's a nonsensical distinction for most people. We just care what's in our wallet. We care what we have in our bank account at the end of the day. So if you use their language and their emotional appeals, things that they're already conditioned to work with, but connect your issues to it, you can reach people. And I think that issues like the Palestine situation are one of them. If you can find ways to put this into language that they can already relate to, things that they already can understand, you bring more people on board. But it does involve, like, shifting the way you talk about things based upon the audience. You frame it for them in a way that actually makes sense to them, instead of assuming a kind of like one size fits all, everyone thinks exactly the same. I don't know if that helps at all or makes sense, because I tend to wander a little bit with these questions. But does that help a bit with the
Yeah,
question
that's
on, like,
great.
emotional?
Yeah, that's exactly my point is trying to reach people and keeping those engaged. So if they're likely to change their mind, and that's what people are trying to reach at the moment. It's the mass numbers and getting them to understand the situation that they might not have any education on. So it's those ones
Right.
that we're trying to kind of, like, reach at this point, and getting them, because there's so many people that are just, like you said, blindly following because they think, oh, well, this is the right thing to do. my government's telling me I need to support people, or, I'm seeing that I just need to blindly support without having any factual information or historical context. So yeah, no, I just think that's great that, it helps people that are having conversations with family or friends. I know people are losing family and friends at the dinner table trying to have this discussion and to reach people.
Yeah.
So it's really helpful for them to have ways of connecting and kind of, having those talking points. And, it's hard to be able to kind of sometimes stay centered and on point to be able, like you said, to reach people on a level
That's
the
the
way they
hardest
can
part, I
understand.
think. I liked when you mentioned that about like newscasters or whatever, because one of the things I've had the hardest time with, and I've tried to um I've discussed with a lot of people. I've led like little kind of mini seminars with political activists in the area, trying to help people to find ways to reach others who wouldn't agree naturally. But the problem is it takes a lot of patience, and you're going to get people that are going to start saying some really fucked up stuff because they're going to fall into the rhetoric that they hear all the time, and they're going to say things that are just wildly wrong. And if you fall for that and go into that and fall back into the way that we would want to argue, then you start to lose them. It's really difficult to stay focused and on message in a way that can actually get through to somebody. It's always very tempting to default to the way that we would think and that we would want to hear an argument, and not necessarily the way that might work for somebody else. And when somebody starts spitting a bunch of really infuriating crap, I totally get why people would kind of like, I can't even with you, and they're just done.
I kind of disagree. I wouldn't say being emotional is always screaming at people.
No, it's not.
I would say, so as a person who is an academic myself, I have taught a bunch of seminars as well, specifically Introduction into Post-Colonial Theory. And as a person who does suffer from generational trauma, because my mother was born under British colonial rule and her father under Italian colonial rule and their parents under Ottoman colonial rule, right? So as a person who comes from generations of people who suffered under colonialism, I think to expect people from the global south or people who have families or who have carry the generational trauma of colonialism to not show emotions is dehumanizing.
Yeah,
Because I think it is fundamentally human to show rage and anger in the face of your subjugation or in the face of the subjugation of people who look like you or your family members.
absolutely.
And I think to expect, victims of oppression and subjugation, or people who carry that trauma, to always be level-headed, to always be logical, to always be like straightforward,
Right.
is dehumanizing. It doesn't
Absolutely.
humanize us at all. And I think for me, I'm not saying he's trying to police people's emotions, by the way. I love Liam. I'm just having a conversation. What I'm saying is, for me, what helped me, because I did it, I've been doing it for more than 3 years. What helped me in my seminars, and I've had many people in my seminars that have had their minds changed, as you said, is finding the right balance between showing emotion, rage, and anger, and staying neutral as well. Focusing on the facts of the matter, but then also focusing on individual cases, because unfortunately, one death is a tragedy, but 1,000 becomes a statistic. And if we always just take an academic route without the emotional aspect of it, I think it's also still dehumanizing the victims that we're talking about. So when I'm saying emotion, I don't mean necessarily just always screaming at people or cussing them out. But sometimes I've seen speeches of people with raised voices that were inspiring. People that were full of rage that were inspiring, because rage sparks change and movement. And I think
Right.
we tend to demonize rage a lot of times when we shouldn't.
Yeah. So we're not actually disagreeing at all. We're essentially addressing a different factor here. For first off, in uh, there are a lot of conversations I have where I show my rage, and I'm perfectly comfortable doing that. There's there's no way in hell I talk about things like the Shoah or the Nakba without seeming absolutely disgusted. But it works in the environment of a classroom because the kind of people that are in there, they're in there to learn, and they're open already to that sort of thing. Um, so it depends on where you are and what you're talking about. So if I'm talking to, I don't know, if you're trying to talk to a bunch of like hardcore right wingers in their own cultural context, in their milieu, then the same rhetoric doesn't work that would work in a classroom or would work with a bunch of lefty activists. So the way that we approach things has to vary a little bit based upon what you're trying to accomplish and with the type of people, I would say. But emotion in general works. And another thing that kind of comes up here, especially when you're talking about where like what I could do, or somebody in a lot of these, a lot of Western countries that doesn't come from, say, an oppressed or uh, refugee background, that sort of thing. Like, okay, so I don't know, I'm stuck with the whole like I'm a cishet white dude at the end of the day, right? So I was born armed to the teeth with the weapons of privilege, and my challenge is trying to disarm myself as much as I can so that I don't steamroll people without intending to. It's a very different sort of framework that I'm in, but who I am allows me to walk in and talk to a bunch of asshole right wingers in my country that probably wouldn't want to listen to someone from the Muslim community. And if I can find a way to pull them away from some of that horrifying shit that they've fallen for, then that's kind of a win for everybody. But it's a different kind of argument and condition. I wouldn't expect somebody um, from an oppressed community to discuss their situation without showing that emotion. But it's not exactly the same kind of situation there. Like uh, I guess the in that specific circumstance, if I'm talking about an injustice that affects somebody else, I'm trying to spread empathy around it, but it's not something that actually affected my family, so it doesn't hurt in the same way, which I think allows um, some different spaces there, and in different circumstances you want to deploy different people too. There are places where I want to stand shoulder to shoulder with an activist from an oppressed community, and we make an argument together because their emotion actually strengthens what I'm trying to say, and that works really, really well. Um, but there's also ways in which my voice can strengthen somebody else's, and we kind of again build a sense of solidarity that we can kind of like work together. So it's not a sense of like, you don't need a white savior to fix you, but requiring oppressed people to fix everything for themselves and save themselves is not fair either, because there are significant structural disadvantages there. So finding a way to bring those different visions together, those different perspectives together, I think can help a lot. Hey. Oh,
Uh,
no, green cat.
Nasser, did you have a question that you wanted to ask?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Hey, Liam.
Hey.
Uh, I just want to ask. I have actually a couple questions, stuff I want to discuss with you. So
Is it
right
possible
now,
you can
this
ask your first question? We can go to Kimberly and then I'll go back to you. Is that okay?
absolutely, absolutely, sure.
Perfect. Go ahead.
Regarding this Zionist aggression right now on Gaza, to be honest, I'm not able to see where it's going. It's like for the first time, it's like I feel like completely lost. But my question regarding this matter, like right now, the past week, like I think two major events happened. The first one is that for the first time since 1982, we as Palestinians are allowed to operate from Lebanon. During like as a Palestinian resistance, we are allowed to operate, and we in the past week they also announced that they are recruiting Palestinians. They're asking, but like this is, I think, is a major uprise. Like Lebanese resistance, they are comrades, but they didn't allow us to operate like this since like for 40 years. And the second thing that happened is yesterday, like the targeting of the U.S. embassy in Iraq. The For the first time, the U.S. embassy was attacked yesterday, or the day before, and timing differences. My question is like, if this, do you think if the U.S. needed to intervene, can the U.S. government sell that need to their people who are right now asking them to stop supporting the Zionist entity? But if they needed to intervene, what can they do to sell it to their own people who are against them supporting them? But I think right now there is like a slight chance that the struggle might like enlarge and the US might intervene in it directly, like regardless from them actually now intervening with some experts and logistic support, but they might actually have to deploy their own like uh, soldiers, that not soldiers, like their destroyers. They might need to use them that are on our coasts right now. So they think they can sell it to their own people.
I don't think there's any real question of that. I think that a majority of the politicians would support it just right off the gate. There's significant parts of the public that would also support it. There's a lot more people who are angry, but it's harder for the people who are opposed to these kind of actions to really affect policy until we're an overwhelming majority. It's a lot harder to push back against it when there's a lot of already built-in structural support for it. Um, I think the biggest pushback that you get right now in our system is only that if Biden does it. Like Republicans would care only because it's Biden doing it, not because they wouldn't want to do exactly the same freaking thing. So they wouldn't push back very hard. And if Trump came in, they'd support it, and you'd have Democrats complaining against Trump doing it, but they would have supported it if it was Biden doing it. It's just partisan bullshit as far as the major parties are concerned. And a lot of the people who most care about this and are most incensed by this policy are the ones that are least politically relevant, I suppose. We have the least power, the least voice. So I don't think that the government would much care. In the long run, you're forced to if a situation stretches out. Johnson found that out, for example, during the Vietnam conflict. He got a few years with no real criticism. Only a bunch like a bunch of students or whatever, but it was pretty low key, and then it's just slowly built up and destroyed it for him. That's one of the biggest lessons the U.S. has learned since Vietnam is to try and keep these conflicts either shorter or at least lower intensity. Even with the longer lived ones we had in Iraq and Afghanistan, far fewer Americans were actually killed or unalive, sorry, which means that they kind of got away with it. Whereas if you had the same rate of fatalities that you saw in the Vietnam conflict, we would have gotten out of Afghanistan a lot faster. So firing missiles, I mean, I could rattle off dozens of places where Americans have just like shrugged their shoulders at us hucking cruise missiles from destroyers at people and blowing stuff up. And people just don't care enough. It's not a big enough issue to get people to push back against it. I'm glad you mentioned the Lebanon issue. I was thinking about that earlier today. Did you see that? Did you see Netanyahu's response to that?
Yes, when he promised he's gonna like make it another Gaza, another Khan Yunis, and now they're saying they want to push them back from the borders. Gallant say that, not Netanyahu. It's
Yeah.
like they,
Mhm. The
yeah.
what the danger here. So I actually have a mad amount of respect for what is happening in Lebanon about this, but I'm also worried about them because it's providing a pretext for another invasion. A significant part of the Israeli political elite have always wanted to conquer a significant part of Lebanon and keep it. A lot of people are still upset that they abandoned South Lebanon because, I mean, the Likud's position always was that the Litani is the natural border for Israel, and they want that. And some of the religious Zionists are arguing that the border should go all the way to Turkey. So this is providing pretext for that kind of intervention, and in the long run, that could really help out with this holding this kind of like far right coalition together for Netanyahu, because they'll only tolerate the bombing in Gaza alone for so long because it's not enough of a war to really hold together a wartime cabinet. But if he launches an attack in Lebanon and there's another occupation there, I think that could strengthen that government, which is a terrifying prospect. So while I respect what they're doing in moral terms, I think it can be very dangerous for the long-term conflict as well.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah.
Uh,
Kimberly dropped out,
oh,
so yeah, floor's yours.
sure. So to be honest, like I disagree with that part because, like, I think if Lebanon like joined the resistance, joined in a full open struggle, this will lead to actually destabilize the entire region. Like, to be honest, right now, let's say the people in countries that are like pro the US, pro Israel, the Arab countries, let's say Jordan and Egypt, these people are barely, like, their governments are now barely holding them. The US realized that. Uh, the US are not allowing Israel to actually launch a full attack against the Lebanese because they know that will destabilize their puppets in the region. I, I I'm really about to lose hope in my people in the Arab world, how they are like, uh, how we are right now, how bad our situation is. But I think a full scale war will actually force us to do something, force us to react, force us to wake up from, force us to realize that our regimes are
Yeah.
actually need to be taken down. And
I,
like also like I think
yeah. I
um
respect the optimism there. Honestly, at this point, I don't have a lot of hope for things like that playing out well, but I do respect the optimism about it, and I share the anger at the governments in the area. It's why I wrote the course on the Arab revolutions, for example. I mean, the needing to change these corrupt kleptocratic regimes. I mean, it's vital, and they're propped up largely by foreign support like the U.S. But I don't think that there's appetite for a larger war. So it would end up being just people in the streets trying to change their governments in order to get that kind of change. But even there, even if ordinary people who do care about the Palestinian issue were to be in charge in all these countries, even if they immediately inherited all the power of all the surrounding Arab countries, it wouldn't actually change the calculus at all. Yeah, I mean, it still wouldn't change any of the strategic factors here. I still think that if the Israelis wanted to, they would paste whatever they wanted to, and the U.S. would stand by protecting them in the process, which is it's sad, but I mean the populations in the surrounding countries aren't really aren't an advantage in this case. They're much larger countries, but their militaries are far less professional. They're not as well trained. They're not as well equipped. In the 1967 and 73 wars, the Israelis completely dominated combat, and they were using outclassed like French light tanks. They didn't even have any main battle tanks. Today they've got like American M1 Abrams. I mean that they if you combine they won in those wars because they were better led, not because they were better equipped. Today they're also better equipped. So if you bring more powers in, what this does is it turns into a far bloodier situation, and a whole lot more people will be unalived. And I still don't think it will work out well. And it's a terrifying prospect to me. I'm scared. that it gets that far, because I know what that government is capable of doing.
I agree with you, but my point is I don't think the US will allow Israel to invade Lebanon if that would lead to them, let's say, losing Egypt or losing Jordan from their axis to go to the Russian Chinese axis. Because right now, actually, the Russian Chinese axis in our region is gaining much support. People are leaning
Yeah.
almost everywhere where it's like people are seeing it as a hope to get off get off the U.S. Control. So
A
I
few, a
don't
few minor
think.
players may eventually drift in that direction, but the big ones won't. Egypt won't. Egypt is addicted to the American teat. They're not going to let go. They get a ton of free cash that's handed directly to the military, not even through the government. And it actually helps them to maintain control over that country. So they're perfectly comfortable there. I mean, they didn't they didn't do a damn thing about the invasion in '82, and the Israelis were there from '82 to 2000, and Egypt didn't say a damn thing about it. They're I don't think that they would oppose it. It may cause some players to peel out of that, but for the most part, a lot of the other ones in the region, the Gulf states in particular, they're motivated much more by money anyway, and they know that their connections into the European American markets and the Japanese are more valuable to them right now than the Russian and Chinese could be. So I don't think that they would back out of it either. In the short term, I don't think it could change the diplomatic calculus either. But the long term trends are there, and the strategic competition with rising Chinese power in the area in the long run will present much more of a problem for maintaining American hegemony in the area. But I don't think we're anywhere near there yet.
But I
Clearly, it
mean,
looks like. Sorry, go
I'm
ahead,
sorry.
Nasser. I
I
think
just
Clearly
want to
wanted to
add to
jump
what
in.
Nasser was saying. Yeah, thank you, Bila. So you said I understand. You said you had a book, Liam, about this subject, the Arab Spring or the revolutions.
I teach a class on it.
Okay.
I have a whole bookshelf on
No,
about it, but
no. I meant like this
it's just
specific one. I wanted to read up more on it because my question is
oh
kind
yeah.
of more tied into what Nasser was talking about. I'm curious to your perspective. Like, do you think what happened in 2008 in Gaza is what led to the Arab Spring?
Um, no, the that would have been built brewing for quite a long time. The this is honestly funny because there were so many people completely caught flat-footed about this in Washington D.C. and in the media, and I'm just sitting around talking to my colleagues and like, what the fuck? How do they not know? We've been telling them this for ages. There's a shit ton of books on this. We're all telling them like people are angry. They want democracy. There's
Yeah.
increasing press freedoms there. People are talking about this stuff. It's going to happen. This is coming. Um, the um, the single biggest issues, well, gosh, there's so many factors. Okay, so a larger Arab public sphere, a wider shared media space where issues in one place can immediately be seen by and reacted to in another, and they can share ideas sort of transnationally, was a huge factor. And some of that public sphere, including much more open debate. So networks like Al Jazeera having like talk show hosts who are where you've got like guests and they're arguing with each other, where Arab television in the decades before that was just somebody giving you the official line. I mean, and everyone knew, like serious state broadcasters, Sana, everyone knew they were lying. I mean, it's the government's line, but it's all you had. But starting to see a range of views and debate started changing things, and and that contributed a lot to it. But you also have a significant amount of economic crises building up there since the shift toward neoliberalism in the 70s and 80s, where living standards started falling instead of beginning to build up. So you have huge numbers of young people that have no prospect of getting a job and getting angry there, and all the resistance movements building up around that. I mean, there's just so many factors. The Palestinians, in the long run, I think the single biggest influence was less the '08 Gaza thing, but more the longer term processes of the intifadas. So the very first Palestinian intifada actually had a significant influence on trends within the wider Arab world. These things don't have to be successful to be influential, because you're seeing young people standing up and hucking rocks at tanks. It actually, like, holy crap, it can help to break down the wall of fear. But ultimately, what turned it into a wider uprising that spread everywhere was Tunisia. It's really worth knowing, and I try to remind people of this, to forget the chronology of this a lot, because they blur together for a lot of people. But the first big protest in any other Arab country didn't happen until after the Tunisian regime had already fallen. 25th January in Egypt was after the government of Ben Ali had already fallen. So seeing that it could work broke down the walls of fear. It gave
That's
people a sense of hope.
yeah. No, but that's what I'm saying is like I also feel like that was one of the main reasons Egypt kind of did what they like. There was kind of a boiling point, and like you said, they saw somebody like do it before them, so they're like, maybe we could do it too. So right now, like we're seeing Gaza without a military take on the so-called strongest military in in the region.
Mhm.
So I just feel like I know you said you're not you admire his optimism, but you still don't think that the surrounding people who are connected, like with the Palestinian cause very strongly, won't as well try to overthrow these regimes that are helping Israel advance into Gaza.
I want to see them try again. I was actually disappointed that the uprisings have slowed down a bit, that they've fizzled a bit, because the anger is still there. The activist groups are still there. There's still a lot of all the basic features that made them boil over in 11 and 12 in the first place are still there.
Yeah, yeah,
But but with the partial exception of Tunisia, every single one failed. And I think that is discouraging to a lot of people about the attempt. People would need to rise up again, and they honestly, I want people to. I want that shit to happen. But even if they were to rise up and gain control of it, I don't think it changes the situation for Israel and Palestine in the sense of intervention. But I think that it really could start a chain reaction that could ultimately change the region as a whole, and it could force changes in both Israeli and American policy in the area. So it's genuinely a good thing. If more of the Arab world democratizes, and and the state's actions reflect popular views, it'll be a lot harder for um, the status quo to survive. So I
yeah,
I'm absolutely there with you in terms of
and
cheering on
yeah,
and hoping that they do it.
me too. Yeah, no, I just think as well, like when you were talking about the warfare, like right now they have the tanks. What are they? The Mark, they're like the M1 Abrams, you said, pretty much. So, but what we're witnessing now is like these homemade RPGs are taking out these tanks. So it's kind of like $200 weapon is taking out this $3 million weapon. A lot of people are like getting ideas, no?
It is, but there's a lot of them, and look at the cost for it. 90% of people in the strip are displaced.
Yeah, yeah.
60% of the housing is already destroyed. I mean, it's
But at the
uh,
same time, but Egypt has like actual weapons, not these ones made in like a
oh, it does, but
homemade
that's
weapon.
different. See, honestly, ordinary people. This is one fun one I do in terms of like looking when you talk about the actual combat in
Yeah.
the 48 war. The completely untrained volunteers from the Muslim Brotherhood fought better than the Egyptian army did. The militaries in the Arab world are very, very badly run,
But
and
that at that
that's no
time it
shame to the
wasn't
ordinary
wasn't that
people.
because
Their
of like
leadership is terrible.
yeah, wasn't that because their leadership yeah, like you took the words
It's
out
the
of my
leadership,
mouth.
yeah.
Yeah.
The officer corps are terrible. It's deeply corrupt. It's basically just a cash cow for people. I don't think that they'd be able to use it. And even there's problems. Even if you look at okay, so at its height, the '73 war is an interesting one. There, they bought tons and tons of Soviet arms, including some of the very latest like surface to air missiles to kind of wipe out Israel's air advantage. But they when they actually told the soldiers to advance, they stopped at the outer range of the sand batteries and refused to go any farther because they understood if they went further into the Sinai, the Israeli Air Force could pace them. At the end of the day, conscript militaries don't have the same will to fight as militias do, or as nationalistly, really driven forces like the IDF that are driven by an ideological concern. The military in places like Egypt is, I mean, a lot of the soldiers, they're not fighting for a cause. They got a decent job to support their family, so they're not willing to throw themselves. People don't want to throw their lives away for this. Um, the fighters that you're seeing in the strip, they're fighting for their homes, they're fighting for their families, and they're fighting for an ideology. They have a reason to fight that the Egyptians just do not share. So I think if you want to see wider conflict, I think asymmetric warfare you can definitely see more of. Malicious stuff. And at the end of the day, you can wear down a big power that way. I mean, they had a lot of help from major militaries, but at the end of the day, the Viet Minh still did a lot of damage to the U.S. military. It's entirely possible to build up that kind of resistance, but I would not. I wouldn't get my hopes up about the Arab militaries doing anything useful.
Nasser, I feel like I cut you off midway. Did you want to finish, or has some of that been covered already?
Oh yeah, I want to just comment a bit because I think I was like misunderstood. Uh, I really don't have hope in like the Arab military institutions as militaries. But my point was, the U.S. they support the Zionist entity because, as Biden said, it supports their interests in the region. But
Mhm.
if a wider conflict like happened, uh, some regimes who are pro-US started changing, then their support to the Zionist entity would actually contradict with the purpose they're supporting it. They're starting to lose their interest because of it. Like right now, for the
Mhm.
first time in like years and years, we see like a Kuwait who has been like Kuwait probably was the most pro-US country in the region because of their conflicts with Saddam Hussein, and
Mhm.
they are like the ones who were cheering the American forces. Right now, we're
Mhm.
asking to kick the people are asking to kick Americans out. We're seeing people in Gulf countries go to British soldiers while they're having their lunch and telling them, leave our country. We don't want you here. We, you support the killing of our brothers. We don't want you here. Like these
Mhm.
regimes who are like been rooted in our region can be actually removed, which will affect the U.S. interests. And like I want to point out actually something that I really believe in. Now you said like a golden point where the military who the person who fights for a salary is not like someone who fights with for an ideology. This is like completely 110% correct. The thing is like in the I'm pretty sure right now 80% of the Arab youth are daydreaming about dying for Palestine. They are daydreaming about it. Like it's the idea of sacrifice. It has been deeply rooted in the Arab history.
Mhm.
Islam actually took it from Arabs. Like Islam didn't bring it to us. It's before it was dying. Now it's became dying for your religion, but Islam like took it from the Arab world. So I think like actually, let's say for example, let's say the Jordanian regime was destabilized, which is like has huge potential, most likely because more than the half of the majority um, are Palestinians. This will open like the route for smuggling uh, weapons into the Palestinian resistance in the West Bank. Let's say the Egyptian regime was weakened, then the tunnels are back right now. So instead of the homemade weapons the resistance in Gaza now have, they'll start having more weapons from the access to the resistance. I think those are factors that could like lead the US to push back the Israel against any invasion in Lebanon. And also one more
Possibly.
thing, like right now, sorry.
Hey.
You wanted to say something? I'm sorry, Liam.
Oh, no, I got a couple thoughts already, but you look like you were trying to finish something.
Oh, yeah. And I think right now, what's like major difference between these previous wars we had is that right now, like if you, well, I'm like a big fan. I'm actually named after Jamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian leader, and I am actually a huge fan of him. But his speeches were all were like propaganda to raise the morality. Right now, we have the Lebanese resistance leader. He's actually talking to us with complete sense. He's telling us right now we are not ready to hit them with the knockout. We're not ready to uproot them at the moment. We are ready to win by points. We're ready to make small victories against them. He's not saying that they cannot enter Lebanon. He said it directly. He said they can enter it, but can they hold it? That's like right now they're like uh, they're like letting their people support the war by telling them we need to free the hostages. We
Mhm.
need to go and take revenge for what happened on 7th of October.
Mhm.
But I don't think they can also, the Israelis themselves, the Israeli government can sell to their people the need to go to war against Lebanon only because they support the Palestinian resistance and to go to invade Lebanon. Because right
Oh,
now in the Israeli
they-
community, the losses of soldiers are not taken easily. They're like, in the Israel community, actually, they prefer to see 20 civilians dead than one soldier. To them, a soldier dying is too difficult for them to hear, to understand. So I think if they actually went into Lebanon, also besides the fact that it will destabilize the entire region, because like the other fact is to Gaza, there is no way for volunteers, for Arab volunteers to go there. But to Lebanon, there are ways you can go there. You can go there from Syria. You can go there from Iraq. I think they'll have also they have an access right now that supports them. They're not alone. Like in the 2006 war, Israel actually asked them for a ceasefire, which by then the Lebanese resistance was much weaker than they are now. And they didn't have a strong access. I did it right now. I mean, the Iraqi was complete ruin. Yemen was a complete ruin.
Mhm.
So I think these are all like I don't. I am like a
Granted,
fully
Syria and
hardened
Lebanon are both in bad shape
Marxist-Leninist.
right now too, though.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Granted, Syria and Lebanon are both in bad shape right now too. I mean, yeah, Lebanon has been struggling with under the weight of huge numbers of refugees and all the chaos from that. Syria is basically bombed back into the Stone Age. Uh, so there are routes through for outside weapons from the Iranians and whatnot. So there's things like that, but it's not like they're at their peak strength either. Hezbollah spent a lot of time fighting in Syria and depleted itself in part in some of that fighting too. I think
I
there's something about the U.S. interest. You're kind of you're on the right track with part of it, but the key here is that there's a lot of interest. It's not just um, there's no single one. The one U.S. interest actually is supporting Zionism at the end of the day. A fellow commitment to the nationalism here because of the deep history of Christian Zionism on the right. And especially if Trump gets in there instead of Biden, that gets even stronger because the Republican base is hardcore behind that evangelical shit. So I don't think that they care about losing a few allies in the area if it meant propping up a state that could help bring about the apocalypse. So there are multiple interests here. It's not just one that we have to kind of keep in mind in terms of the shifting American position. there's a real wild card. There are ways to convince us to back down. I don't think military action is one of them. And honestly, the single biggest fear I have about this extending into Lebanon is the Israelis have shown practically from the beginning of the state that if there are attacks across the border, they will strike back. This is why a lot of those countries stopped doing it, and they've been pissing off their own people by not resisting. But honestly, they had little choice because they kept getting their asses handed to them over and over and over again. Every time militants snuck across the border, the Israelis would respond with artillery or an airstrike or an incursion of ground forces where they would go in and just shoot things up. And none of these Arab states could ever prevent that. And at the end of the day, a whole bunch of your people die, a bunch of your infrastructure is destroyed because you allowed the militants to do things. It's one of the reasons that they eventually chased the PLO out of the area, because it was actually harming the stability of those states all around there. This issue is very popular on the wider Arab street. It's not popular really in the capitals because they have a better sense of what this has cost them in the past. And I think that if this does spiral into a bigger thing, if Lebanon actually does step on this landmine, I don't think a lot of other countries are going to want to get involved either, because this really, really hurt them before. And I don't think any of them could really afford a significant conflict like that. None of them want to be bombed. I mean, how often do they still do it all the freaking time? You know, they whenever they hear about like some weapons being shipped through, smuggled through Syria, whatever you want to think, trying to get down to like the other age group in Lebanon, the Israelis send in jets and bomb Syria, and they've done it over and over and over again. And I think that's a really big deterrent to a lot of those societies to get involved overall. A lot of people would want it to happen, but I don't think the governments would. You know, under really any circumstance. I can't imagine a circumstance where the other governments actually get involved directly. You know, I mean, it would cost them way too much. Even if the Israelis would lose something, they would go down with so much bloodshed that I don't think it's worth it to anybody. And that's where for me it's terrifying, because there are so many freaking fundamentalists in charge in Israel right now that if they're poked, I cannot even guess how far they'd go.
Ness.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Yeah.
Thank you, Nazir.
You're
Ness, I
making my
think you were
nose itch.
next, and then I've got a
You
couple of
gotta move
questions
further.
from the chat.
You gotta move further.
Liam, are you okay to take Ness's question, or do you want to take a break first?
What was that?
I was asking if you wanted to take a break, or should we go to Ness, who's got next question?
Yeah, we can go on. I probably don't want to stay on too much longer tonight, especially since I can come on again tomorrow or something. Because it has been a long day. But no, I just needed to
So,
take a break from the cat because my nose is itching. I'm highly allergic to cats, but I like them. So
so we'll go to Ness, and then I've got two questions from the chat, and I think we can end there today if you want.
okay, sure.
Yeah,
Oh,
Ness,
I
over
saw.
to you.
There's one I saw that somebody was asking. I saw one go by and said from Ireland. Someone was asking if Israelis and Palestinians are both indigenous, and I'll just simply say yes. And I actually, it's one of the few things that I've actually recorded a full video on already on this, because I've not been on TikTok very long, but there's like a little, I don't know, 9 or so minute thing where I kind of walk through why and how they're connected going all the way back to the Stone Age. So to the person who asked that, I'd say the simplest thing is go yes is the answer, and then go watch that video and you can see exactly how. And then what are the ones that you saw?
I just had a question, if I could, if there was nothing else. So in
I'd be blessed to have something in
terms of,
the chats, but if you want to jump in there first,
that's all right.
she seems to
Was there
stop first.
anything else?
Okay, cool.
Thank you. Yeah, so in terms of the current dynamics of the Arab, Middle Eastern, North African Arabs, etc., I think you're absolutely right. It's, in my opinion, it is going to take something catastrophic or potentially the only way this works is for the people to rise up so much going to topple their governments. And as we know, with a lot of Arab governments and most governments around the world, it's to protect their position. So unless there's a massive uprising, it's just not going to go anywhere, and they're just going to stand in their positions. The comment about Lebanon, I think, is a little bit different depending on how they get involved. I know it's currently just the H group from the north, from Lebanon, who's involved. It's not really the military itself. And you could say, they're a arm of that military because, surely they're being supported somehow. But in terms of, I guess, the public opinion or those sort of things, as Nassar was saying before, there is quite a deep want, a deep need, a daydream, I think he mentioned, for the young, Arab nations, because we feel it. So I myself am from Tunisia, and having grown up, only for a few years there, even my brothers, we feel that pain. We want to get in there and fix it, so to speak. But the thing, I guess, that my question leads to is, what do you foresee, being an expert in the area and I guess the Middle East and North Africa and all that sort of stuff, what do you see, how long, firstly, could Israel sustain their current position of outright, bombardment of Gaza and the West Bank, etc.? How long would that be sustainable? Because it's longer than it's ever been before in terms of the number of weeks. It's also more than ever seen in terms of the number of casualties, etc. So, my opinion, I don't know if this is something that would make sense, but I think it's like potentially beyond Christmas is unrealistic. That's just what I think. Whether or not there's some other pause around that time for political / all those sort of reasons, I don't know. But how long do you foresee Israel being able to continue this, both from a military perspective, because I think militarily they could go on for months and months, but in terms of the shift of public opinion, generally speaking, in the West, and surrounds?
So the question more about what other people will tolerate as opposed to their own internal dynamics.
Yeah, I think potentially both, because my
Okay.
theory is, just with any other apartheid states, until the people who are in that country, in that region, until the Israelis stand up and say we've had enough and topple their own government and make a shift change, I don't think this is going to end in terms of real progress, if that makes sense. And I mean in the region, in that area, because at the end of the day, militarily they could go on for quite some time, especially if they're being propped up by the United States and its allies.
Yeah.
So in terms of that side of things, I don't think that's realistic, but I guess the temporary conflict, it will fizzle down. I don't know that. I guess my question is sort of more theoretical more than anything else, but just an opinion of, at what point do you think this current conflict will fizzle down? And do you think there is any hope for Israelis to have a cultural dynamically, a huge cultural change, to want this really all to end and have some permanent peace?
No, that's a big one. The last one there. I was a lot more optimistic on that last point before than I have been in the last 10 years. You go back 20 years, I was a lot more hopeful. But the peace factions have actually been losing ground instead of gaining ground, largely because of other structural factors in the state. Tons and tons of the secular and leftist populations just leaving the country. It's just unsustainable to them. And the right has gotten stronger and stronger, and they keep engineering situations to strengthen themselves. Honestly, these attacks on the strip are in part intended to perpetuate this, because whenever there's a fight, whenever you can provoke people to shoot back at you it makes it easier for right wingers to cling to power and to push this. So regular military action actually sustains their ideological position, and it makes it harder to back down. And as the country has grown more radical in terms of its political class, it's a lot harder to pull back from it. A lot of the population would still be kind of unhappy with this stretching on forever, because it's going to have an economic impact. People will be unaliving them, people will be lost. I mean, there's all kinds of factors there, but as long as you can keep the fear going, as long as there's a credible threat. And honestly, if more players like Lebanon get involved, if there are attacks in different areas, then that plays into the long-term bunker mentality that's been cultivated in Israel since before it existed. There's a sense of rallying around to defend that will kind of come back up. And I think that the more people get involved, the more this expands beyond the strip, the longer it can last without actually running into significant resistance inside the state. There's already people unhappy about it that want it to end. But are they
Yeah.
politically significant? Can they end it? That's the factor. And I don't see, if more players get involved, I think that gets harder to end. For the U.S. and propping up the military and economic aspect, the fact that they get $4 billion from us alone, plus all the aid they get from everybody else, stuff coming in from the Germans, the French, everyone else that can possibly support them. I think they could sustain it for quite a while there too. So the way we can make this end sooner is changing public opinion more broadly in these other countries so that it forces the political class. Other than that, I don't know that there's much that they can really do. I'm honestly disgusted that we've allowed them to basically demolish nearly all of the strip and make 90% of people homeless, and people are still like, meh, it's fine.
Yeah.
I mean, like vetoing a ceasefire, like what the fuck? Um,
Yeah.
I think a lot of other countries would be happy. The fact that Britain and France voted for the ceasefire is a positive sign already. But the U.S. support is probably enough to stretch it out for a while. Not as long as if they had wider support, and they're losing that fast. But they still have a lock on U.S. support. So, I mean,
That
past
makes
Christmas makes some sense, but I don't think this could go on for months. I think this will peter down sometime in the winter. But whether it's later in December or later in January, I couldn't say. But I don't think it could possibly go past winter on current trajectories unless it turns into a bigger conflict. If you get other players involved, all bets are off. But if nobody else really gets involved, I think this will probably wind down in January
yeah.
or by
Yeah,
January.
that makes a lot of sense. And I think in terms of the region, I can't imagine any of the Arab states certainly getting involved. Um, Potentially, like if it does, like you said, go towards Lebanon, south of Lebanon, I don't think anyone will get involved. If it gets closer to the Turkish border, then of course Turkey will have no choice but to get involved because they don't want
Right.
Israel on their doorstep. But yeah,
Exactly.
that,
Yeah. I think if they just go into South Lebanon, I don't think anybody will bat an eyelash again. I think it'll be just like the '80s all over again. But if it
yeah,
extends beyond that, yeah, I think that it would start to introduce certain complications.
yeah. Thank you.
Question that was asked in the chat, but I'll see if I can paraphrase it. I think a couple of people mentioned that they believe the people who are interested in seeing an end to what's happening right now seem to be leaving. But I'll add to that by saying we've seen
Hold
both.
on. I think I misunderstood something already.
Sure.
Is- I- you back up and
Yeah. So they said, I mean, to quote what they said in the comment, they said 500,000 Israelis are leaving who are objecting to what's happening. And we've also seen some
Mhm,
anti-government protests that have happened this week in Israel.
mhm.
Is there some hope that if we put pressure on the Israeli government, that we can see an end to what's happening sooner?
Who is we?
I
No.
guess the greater world, the general public that is showing solidarity for Palestine.
The biggest single issue is still the U.S. As long as the U.S. government is marching in lockstep with Netanyahu's coalition, that doesn't change. They can ignore the Europeans. They do it a lot, but they can't lose everybody. So if they lose the U.S. as well, that will stop them right away. So the single best thing anybody could really do is find some way to get a change here. And the simple fact is, I mean, that's harder than a lot of people I think realize. And I hope that, honestly, I hope that people can remember. I'll always try to be hopeful about this, but the trick is this happens over and over again, and people always forget. And it's easy for people to think that, well, maybe the Democrats will be better next time about this issue, and they never are. Honestly, historically, there's been more criticism from Republican administrations toward Israel than there has been from Democratic ones, but oftentimes more because of the strategic ones. So when the questions were brought up earlier about I think some of Nasser's positions about like the U.S. relations in the area, Republicans are historically more likely to care about that, but they don't anymore because it's now a populist party. The shift in the last few decades has changed that calculus a lot. So now both major parties in the U.S. are pretty much happy to write blank checks for the Israelis. So it's going to take a lot of change in U.S. political culture. Um, if the whole rest of the world puts up enough of a fight here, hopefully that can eventually convince the U.S. to back down. And within tons of other countries, if people can get their governments to start yelling at the U.S. government, maybe we can get somewhere. But I don't see any realistic hope that the U.S. is going to intervene to tell them to stop. I think that they'll stop. We'll let the Israelis stop whenever the Israelis feel like stopping, which it sucks, but um, I don't know if we
Since
can
you
do
kind of
that.
brought it to American politics, Liam, earlier you were saying, or someone brought up 3.5%, and then you said like earlier, like this just came to my mind, it popped up again. You said in order for like some real change to happen, or maybe not like a military revolution, but like a political revolution, a lot of things have to like come aligned. So,
Mm-hmm.
do you think, like, in regards to American politics on both ends, like blue and red, people are kind of sick and tired of just going with the status quo, and they could use this to go for a third party, maybe?
Not for a third, no. That
You
I
wouldn't,
wish
it wouldn't be
I,
possible, like
I
at this
really wish
time?
it would, but there are there are a lot of legal obstacles to them actually
Oh,
operating because of the way things work. And there's financial obstacles. They just don't have the money. And because of those two factors, most people are going to still pull the lever for the major parties because they would think that the vote is wasted, so to speak. Realistically, it's only ever wasted if
yeah.
we all still think that. But
That's the thing, yeah.
but money talks at the end of the day, and none of the parties actually have the ability to actually get on the airwaves. They don't have the resources. There hasn't been a significant third party
But
threat
what
in a
are the
long,
exact
long
like
time.
legal like complications, like the obstacles, like
Yeah.
from what I'm understanding, IPAC's not a foreign, it's not considered foreign country. Like
Well,
that's
no.
why they're allowed to lobby so much. Like
Well, yeah.
even
But again, they're only one of many American lobbies that directly support the Israelis.
but
But
say for
no, but
example, a
they're not foreign.
lobbying
They're Americans.
another like PAC gets like some funding from foreign government. Is that not possible?
Uh, it's it's a violation of campaign finance laws. Super PACs have a little bit more freedom there, but they can't coordinate with campaigns at all. But even there are there are still some restrictions for foreign cash coming in. It is still actually quite difficult uh to to get foreign money into elections. They
Yeah, it's
do
all
it though,
kind of
but
confusing
they
to
they
me.
launder it in weird ways. It's
Yeah,
technically illegal.
technically.
Yeah, this is a deeply corrupt country. You know, we just hide it better than some countries do. You know, but, um, Americans have gotten really good at disguising how corrupt we are. But yeah, but we are a super corrupt society. But it's yeah, I I have often lamented this stuff. And again, I've been supporters of like small parties for my entire voting history. I The only time I've ever been a member of the major parties was when I was actually trying actively to participate in the process, um, in the around the Bernie Krat period, and then I jumped immediately back out and became a Green again. You know, I can't stand our major parties here. They're both monstrous, but we haven't had any significant competition for a long time. The problem at the end of the day is the voting system as a whole. The way that a constitution was written, it really it was designed without political parties in mind, and the way it's set up only really works with two of them because it's a basic winner take all and managed at the state level. When the Republican Party came into existence, it replaced the Whigs. So it wasn't really a third. It showed up as a third party, but the other one went poof immediately. And the last time there were significant attempts at building really viable third parties to replace them was the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, so a little over 100 years ago. And they passed a lot of laws since then to make it a lot harder to do so that people don't do something, so that the things like the People's Party, the Progressive Party, and the Socialist Party will never be a threat again. Because all three of them were becoming competitive and were actually winning at some lower levels. But they 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 made the system much harder to prevent that from happening. So the Constitution is a big enough barrier to begin with, and then on top of that, they've added a whole lot of other shit. So at the end of the day, taking control of one of the major parties is the only real hope, short of, I don't know, a real revolution and getting a real constitution. I mean, this country's constitution is trash, but it was written, 2.5 centuries ago. I mean, it wasn't intended to be a modern democracy like the rest of the rich ones. It was one of the reasons we're not really very democratic. It was written to be, a small oligarchy, basically, and it works pretty well at what it was intended to do. So yeah, no, I'm not optimistic that this is going to push a third party run. In fact, I think the signs are less strong for that now than they were when Nader was running. Um,
Is
but
he going for what is that? Will be like the 10th time now? Ralph
what was
Nader,
it?
right?
Oh,
Is he
Nader ran
running
three
again?
times. I pulled a lever for Nader three times, but but again, I've supported a lot of minor candidates like that over the years. But I don't. I think that you had more of a push then, and more people, angry at the overall party system at the time than I think we realistically see now. I think there's a lot of people are pretty hopeless about it. More people are just tuning out. They're just giving up on it. So it's one of the reasons that overall participation has been falling so much. The only reason that it did all right last time around was because people were either energized by Trump or terrified by Trump. And that's the biggest single threat we really have, is that the Democrats are so thoroughly incompetent in the way that they manage this, and liberals and conservatives are so frequently complicit with fascist and populist movements that all they're doing is they're making it easier for Trump or a later demagogue to finally seize power here. I think that's realistically more the direction we're headed than anything better, and that freaking terrifies me. The I try to bring this up a lot, and when you're looking, like, I don't know, trying to apply like historical lens to contemporary politics, because there's a lot of structural differences between, say, Italy in the teens and 20s, or Germany in the 20s, than from the U.S. Today. But the way that the different parties react, the way the different ideologies react, is exactly the same. Conservatives and liberals are always going to be more comfortable with fascism than they will be with socialism. So there actually was a significant leftist alternative that actually did show up, you'd see tons of liberals just straight up supporting a Trumpist style movement instead. It's the U.S. is a frighteningly right wing country.
Something else to add. I think that might be a good stopping point for today, because there's several questions from the chat, but I feel like if I ask them, we'll be here for another 3 hours today. So I'm going to have to put a pin on them for next time.
Yeah. If you can. Okay, so anybody who asked a question that really wants one, I think I have. Let's see what's going on. If I start earlier, tomorrow, like earlier in the evening, I could chat for a bit tomorrow. But I am working outside in the yard on Sunday, but I won't have the energy for it tomorrow. It's the end of a long week. But on Sunday and Monday, I'm gonna be working trying to finish my fence. So, yeah, maybe tomorrow evening I can pop in, be on here for a few hours again, and then people can throw some more questions around then.
Perfect. Yeah, because I think just digging a little bit deeper on this shift that we're seeing towards the far right, and particularly with regards to what's happening in Palestine and Israel, is probably a good starting point for tomorrow. What time do you think
Yeah,
your
that's
time?
gosh, yeah, it's actually good. I've been trying to um, find a way to, I don't know, make my schedule work a little bit easier so I've got a bit more energy for writing. I was making some real progress on my manuscript on neo-fascism. Um, I've been working on a book for that for a while. And actually the department at one of my universities is asking me to make a class around it too. So that'll be fun. It'll be a neat way to kind of like work through some of that material. But now I'm kind of like, oh God, I'm so frustrated by this stuff that I kind of want to go back and work on the Israel Palestine uh, project that I had before. But I got sucked into a big old research project on far right populism because with the it's I mean Trump and Orban and Putin and Erdogan, and there's just so many Le Pen. There's just so many of these fuckers all at once. The commonalities and trends were fascinating to me, so it really got me sucked in. So I've got a partial manuscript where I'm working through these movements in quite a few different countries and looking at the commonalities, how they work, what we can do about them. So yeah, I'd love to dive more into that. Um, for tomorrow, I've been trying to think, and I can't pop over my calendar because the little phone thing's on. But there's somebody's got me in a meeting
Alternatively,
at
what can
11,
yeah,
and
alternatively,
then
what you can do is maybe do what you did today, of just saying, "Oh, I'll be on in half an hour" or something like
yeah,
that, or
yeah,
an hour.
I can't. Let's see, it's 11 1, and then there's I have to pop on it for a little while. There's an office hours thing for like review if anybody wants to do that. I don't know if anybody will. But I'm think by 5 p.m. or so I'm probably done. So I don't know, maybe like 5 or 6 p.m. So it'll be a good bit earlier than today either way. But maybe like somewhere around like 5 or 6 p.m. Pacific time might be great.
Perfect. Just some housekeeping. If you're not already following Liam, please hit the follow at the top. And then if you turn on your notifications, you should be able to get an alert when he's live next. So yeah, I think that's a good starting point. The other thing is also there's a few videos on Liam's TikTok that are worth viewing as well that cover some of the points that have been talked about before that I think some of you will find interesting. But otherwise, yeah, I think the chat was very active today with their own questions back and forth with each other. So that was quite interesting.
Yeah, nice. Well, great. People have an opportunity to chat then. Yeah. And if anything great comes up, then yeah, we can run with it. But yeah, this is
Brilliant.
always fun. So sorry it's been I haven't been able. Sorry, I've only been able to do this once a week for a while, but during winter it should be a little easier for a while, and then I know my schedule is going to be different in spring. I got to look at the calendar and figure out, but I'll come up with a nice little schedule and see if I can find out when I can come on regularly in the spring as well. So, by the way, so
Thanks
anybody
very
else
much.
need
See
more?
you later, Liam.
Yep. Yep. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Salve.
See you blessed.
Okay.
Hey, thanks for having me on,
I can
Liam.
do one, Dennis.
Night. Yeah. Talk to you later. Thanks for answering all my questions. The fact
Yeah,
you
no.
called Trump demagogue, I'm a fan of you now. Accurately depicting him, unlike other people.
Yeah, no, yeah. He's a populist demagogue and dangerous as hell. The
Okay.
only thing the only thing we had to going for us the first time around was that he's relatively incompetent, but they've been doing a lot more planning. They
Oh
will do
no.
a lot more damage if they get back in this time. So I'm nervous as hell, especially since I can't tell people to vote for Biden either because he's trash. So we're kind of screwed one way or the other.
Yeah. Well, talk to you tomorrow. Thanks. Be blessed. Talk to you guys later. Good
Yeah,
night.
Thank
have a
you.
good night, folks.
Hopefully see you tomorrow. Good night.
Oh, purr, purr, purr.